this interview that Anthony and Pierre are doing, they'd asked to find a little bit more about personal side, so I brought some memorabilia with me which I fished out, and the reason for fishing this out will become clear soon. But my early life, really, I was born in Keighley, which is actually only about 4 miles from here, something like that. The hospital where I was born is now demolished, long since demolished. I lived in Skipton, I grew up in Skipton, and I went to Ermysted's Grammar School, and this is one of the school chronicle books that we used to get, I think, every year, I think. And this is one of the Ermysted's Chronicles that I had. I've even actually got something predating that, which is my primary school report book. And as I was showing Pierre, I thought, I'll see if I can find this page again. I was quite, made me smile when one of my teachers said, Andrew has quite a good brain and has made a consistent effort to improve the presentation of his work. So this quite a good brain, yeah, well, that's a nice compliment. And then I got, report books from the school as well. I won't go through all of those. So I went through grammar school. My mum gave me the choice of going to Holy Family, which was a secondary school, or going to the grammar school, because I'd done well enough to go to the grammar school, so I chose to go to the grammar school rather than stay with the religious side. And whilst at Ermysted's, I got interested in home computing with the sort of home computers that were coming out in the early 80s, and that really has set me on a path which, a significant part of that path is, is what makes my makeup now, and it's responsible for me being what I am, I suppose. And this is just another typical example. I've got this from 1984 when the Spectrum Plus came out. I had the earlier Spectrum, and I had a ZX81 before this, and some people will be familiar with these books, and they are quite, pretty amazing really. They teach you how to program. I'll just see if I can find them. So there you've got some program code, for example, which was the sort of thing I was doing in the 1981-82, this came out in 1982, and then I sort of moved on to, in my own time, this wasn't at school, this was all done at home. Here's some assembler code. I managed to find this in the loft the other day, some assembler code. I think that's part of a breakout game that I was doing. That's from Z80 assembler. So I was already pretty well versed in that before I went to university. So I went to Lancaster University, and I've actually got here somewhere, you might need to edit this out. So people have never seen this on camera before, but I think I managed to dig this out. So here, let's see this. This is some certificates. Oh, that's a parachute jump I did. Let me get these in order. I could have got these in a better order. So you might have to edit this slightly. So that was from Lancaster University. So anybody that doubts that that's what I did. Computer science major subject, Bachelor of Science, which was 7th of July 1986. So that was the end result of all the Spectrum stuff and things like that. And then another thing that I managed to keep in my records was my first job offer, which was from this company, GEC Electrical Projects, 7th of April 1986. So that's when I was still at university. I was just about finishing, and I was offered basically a software development role at this place in Rugby, which has long since been demolished and taken over. But they were doing microelectronic software there, which is what I got involved with, some 8086 assembler and this sort of thing. But also following on from that, without going on about this too long, I became interested in teaching and tutoring and that sort of thing. And the other sort of factor that was relevant to mention here was I also became interested in astronomy. So while in Rugby, I was going to the Coventry and Warwickshire Astronomical Society. This was in 1986 to 1988, so I don't know how well the camera can zoom in on this. If I hold this steady, you'll see that one of my early talks, I think this was the second talk I did there, was 1988, 5th of February, Cosmic Plug Holes and Warp Drive, and that was me doing that. And I was quite happy to do that. So that's about black holes and this sort of thing, and all the theories that are still flying around even now, and Stephen Hawking's work on that and stuff, which I've got a different sort of take on now, to be honest. But at the time, that gave me some experience in doing talks and so forth. So that's one of their newsletters, Coventry and Warwickshire Astronomical Society. And then I've actually got a couple of the slides from an earlier talk I gave. This is called The Topology of the Universe. This is about how they developed from the Earth-centered model to everything went around the sun, and then the sun wasn't the centre of the universe, and this sort of thing. So there was that, and then I did another talk on the sun as well. That's my notes from that, which I managed to find in an envelope in the loft. Plasma flares and magnetic storms, so that's all my notes for that book. So this was me sort of getting into the idea of sort of tutoring, well, not so much tutoring, but giving talks and things like this. And then also in parallel with a lot of that, just to go on to the other side of things, which has brought me into the field of the paranormal. Well, the reason that I got this stuff out was because I wanted to try and find this general studies project that I did in the 1980s, in 1982, which was called Close Encounters of the Extraterrestrial Kind, Hallucination, Imagination or Fact. I wasn't able to find that, but I was able to find some of the material that was given to me by a certain gentleman who we might bring into the conversation later, Tony Dodd, because I met him in 1982 thanks to my English teacher who lived across the road from Tony Dodd, and Tony gave me some of the information for the project that I was doing for the General Studies A-level. He didn't give me these came through the post, so I've got the Bufora Bulletin from March 12, 14, 1982, again 1982 time frame. We've got another Bufora Bulletin from September 82 there. So this, all these sort of components were falling into place really at that time. A little bit later, for example, I was still interested in this stuff, and I've got the Unknown Exploring Strange Phenomena, that's from May 1986. I've got a couple of those, I think. Slightly earlier, jumping around in time, this has been sat on my shelf ever since I got it, which is the Marshall Cavendish publication from the 1980s. It's one of these where they basically persuade you to pay about £200 for a book, because you take it all apart and then put it all together, and you can see here we've got things about spontaneous human combustion, and the Stonehenge there, I think that is, and that's not Stonehenge, it's another stone circle. Hypnosis, the Yeti and stuff. So it had all that stuff in it. I didn't get it for that long, but that's again from the 1980s. So these are all there. Some more Bufora type stuff that they sent me. So this all fed into the project, and then we have that again from 1982. So those interests were sort of laid down there. We'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. And then the teaching also, I did this basic teaching qualification in 1992 after I'd been working for a few years, because I now work part-time for the Open University doing online tuition mainly in these sorts of subjects, in technology subjects. So here we have an early thermionic valve transistor from probably the 1990s, I pulled out of some board, and that's a ceramic package for I think an EEPROM chip, which I was working with. That wasn't from 1959, but the integrated circuit was invented in 1959 by Robert Noyce. So that was my teaching aid when I was doing this sort of teacher training course. And then in my working life, I'll tell you just a little bit about that, a couple of things from that we've got here that I brought with me. This was what we were working on in the late 80s, early 90s, a company called GPT, which was like an offshoot of GEC. And this was sort of quite ahead of its time. It was like a smartphone that was both voice and data. It had like a built-in modem, and it was a regular phone as well, and you could do various things with it. I worked on the software which was called the user interface, which would, when you press these buttons on here, it would bring things up on the display, and that was all written in C, because I'd become quite proficient in C programming by that time. And I'll just read out a bit of the press release for that, because they did a press release for the UK release of this. We tried to sell it into America, but it was a commercial failure. GPT brings ISDN to the desktop, and this is September 1991, so we're now over 25 years on from that. Today in London, GPT is launching the first voice and data feature phone for use on the BT ISDN2 network. So this is like an early form of broadband, essentially. It's not the same as the plain old telephone network. The Connect ISDN terminal is part of a portfolio of products from GPT designed to bring the benefits of ISDN to the desktop. So this was something you could plug your desktop computer into and stuff, and then transfer data to other users. So that, that really is some of my background. I later then worked in another company developing some desktop graphics software, a bit like desktop publishing software. It's actually for reprographics, and this is a leaflet that somebody produced for that. So it was like it wasn't really Photoshop. It was more like a very, 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 very primitive version of the InDesign software, as that's become known now. So that was for a company called ProMtech. You see the logo there, and that's sort of homespun business card that was from there that I managed to keep. A lot of this stuff I didn't even know I'd kept it actually. So, and then it was interfaced to a crossfield scanner, which was like a sort of commercial version of a desktop scanner. It's called a drum scanner. So that was that back in the 90s. Went to Southwestern Bell as well. Did some work. This is again jumping around in time a bit. This was for the ISDN project. That was Southwestern Bell. Went to their labs in St. Louis in 1991. And then that's basically it. And then more up to date with the IT side of things. Anthony, who's with us today and is filming this and so forth, we worked together a little bit on this. So Anthony helped me with the sighting of one of these, the Raspberry Pi. This I think is a Raspberry Pi 2 or 3. So it's got the newer board. And so this is like this is kind of like one of the modern versions of the Spectrum, almost, you'd say. You can get these for about 20 quid, and I set up this chemtrail monitoring program which ran on the Raspberry Pi. Whether we get time to talk about that, I'm not sure. So that again brings us up to date with the IT. I'm still doing things with the Raspberry Pi. I've got another little development that I'm doing right now, fairly low level sort of thing, but fairly low key sort of thing I should say, but nevertheless interesting to me. So that really is me in terms of the UFO type stuff, which I've been interested in all my life. This is from 1967. And then we've got the IT side. That's a program I wrote in the 1980s, basic program. So that's part of me as well. And then the sort of tutoring and tuition side of me, which is currently my work for the Open University. So that's a little sort of thumbnail sketch of me, really.
Hello, today we're going to be interviewing Andrew Johnson, and we're going to try and find out a little bit about his upbringing, and also try and have a more intimate, more personal review of his life, and in terms of how he actually got into ufology and the alternative media. So I think first of all, I want to go all the way back to your early childhood, because I think you had 9 siblings, didn't you?
You've got a good memory, that's correct, yeah. Well, I'm the youngest of 9, actually. I'm one of 9 siblings, I should say, so I had 8 siblings, yes. But
so what is it like living in a household with 9?
Well, I mean, we were sort of joking earlier on that we've got 3 Yorkshiremen here today, and we just needed the 4th one to sort of, do the old Monty Python sketch. and although that's obviously cliched, etc., there were elements of that in my upbringing. But having said that, I was the youngest. Yeah. That my eldest sister is 19 years older than me. Right. So you've got that spectrum of ages. Yeah. Some of them, even when I was born, were already working. Right. And so there was a bit of income coming into the house other than what my father was bringing in, which frankly wasn't much. So we had we had a sort of we weren't exactly stricken in poverty completely. Yeah. I think before I was born, my family was poorer than after I was born financially. So we didn't really have we didn't get a colour television, I think, until I think it was probably the very late 70s or early 80s, and that we only got that because my brother was a TV engineer and he used to fix them. So I think it was one that second-hand one that he'd fixed or something. So things like that.
In terms of your psychology, how do you think that feeds in terms of, did it make you more competitive? Did you have to, were you always seeking for attention, or did you just keep your head down?
No, I think for me it seemed to be the case that all the elder siblings, they'd already done things with their lives. My youngest sister, for example, she was quite a sort of. She'd like to go out socialising with her friends, and she was going into the pubs at an early age, and things like that. And I didn't do that. elder brothers, they were working.
Yeah.
One brother, he worked at the quarry. The other brother, he worked at the TV engineer place.
Right.
So I had various sort of role models around me,
Okay.
and I just found my own path basically,
Right.
because it seemed like a lot of what I was doing wasn't of any interest to them particularly. So I just focused on my own interests.
Was there anyone of your age who you hung out with, a brother or a sister?
Well, not particularly, because my brother, who was the youngest brother, he was 7 years older than me, so that's a sort of reasonable size gap. I didn't get that well with my sister particularly. She again had her own group of friends. So I mean, I used to hang out with a few school friends and things like that. But I was pretty much, I did do my own thing a lot of the time.
You did your own thing.
Yeah.
And what was you like at school? Because I was saying that I could imagine you, although perhaps being quite conformist, that underneath that you could be perhaps quite subversive. I mean, was there any time that you were subversive at school, even in a quiet way? Or?
Well, I mean, I don't think so really. I sort of followed I followed the sort of conventional way of doing things at school, and I went to grammar school. I went to Ermisted's grammar school.
Right, okay. So your grades, in other words, were very good to excellent.
Yeah, I mean, they were satisfactory certainly, and I was very conventional at school. I didn't rock the boat particularly. I didn't, really go outside of the lines particularly. I didn't really get into any trouble.
So what were your favourite subjects? Presumably science? Or?
Correct, yes. I always enjoyed the sciences, and we had good science teachers. We had a good chemistry teacher.
Yeah.
I enjoyed doing the experiments in chemistry and in physics. And all those things. So I did maths, physics, chemistry A-levels.
Yeah.
I did sort of science, GCSEs, and geography, English language, English literature, French.
Yeah.
So that, I think, that was, as I think was designed to be, was a good sort of general basis.
Good grounding,
I knew a little bit about a fair number of things. And I had influences in my family, like I say, the brother Chris, who used to fix televisions. Yeah. He sort of gave me an interest in electronics. I was building sort of an electronics kit when I was about 14.
Right. What about building computers, or just?
Yeah, well, that's sort of the next thing, because by 1981, some of the home computers had come out.
The ZX Spectrum,
exactly. Yeah, it was exactly. That was 1982. I had the ZX81, which was the year before.
Is that the one which was about 3K?
Yeah, it was 1K of memory. It was a black thing.
So it was very different from the 48K one.
Yes, it was, and it was the same basic sort of platform, if you will. But it was the Spectrum, or it was originally going to be called the ZX82, but the Spectrum was much more advanced. But the ZX81, Chris, he built that from a kit. Right. We got that. I saved up my paper round money because I did a paper round for 6 years, and got the ZX81. Taught myself how to program that. That was in the gap between my O levels, which are now called GCSEs, and A levels. I had about 10-week holiday there, and within that period I taught myself the basics of computer programming.
So you were always, in terms of learning, always very self-sustained, always very
pretty
focused.
Much, yeah. I mean, I had the sort of brain that was technically minded, so I was able to try and unpick problems. One of the things that I did with the Spectrum, particularly spent quite a number of hours on, is a kind of hacking process, because when you got I used to like playing the games like a lot of the kids did then.
Which was your favourite game then? Can you remember?
One of the favourites, the two classics, of course, on the Spectrum were Manic Miner.
Manic Miner, of course,
and Jetpack. But one of my all-time favourites.
I was thinking of Jet Set Willy, but
there's Jet Set Willy. That was Manic Miner too, indeed. Yes.
Yeah. Do you remember the tune still? Do 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 do.
Some of that tune, I mean, the first Manic Miner, that was Hall of the Mountain King. The second one, I can't remember. I think it was it was based on If I Were a Rich Man. So Jet Set Willy was based on If I Were a Rich Man, if I remember that rightly. But yeah,
have you still got your Spectrum, Andrew?
I've still got a Spectrum. It's not the original version. Okay, because that broke basically. But I have got a Spectrum in the loft. Yeah, I've kept that. And going back to the days of the Spectrum, that was obviously very important, because you talked about being self-sufficient. You had to be quite self-sufficient on the Spectrum, and I used to do this sort of hacking process. and the tapes that you got, which had the games on, they had protection mechanisms on them. They used to speed up the tape. Yeah. So if you tried to copy them on a tape-to-tape machine, it wouldn't work. Occasionally it would work. So what I started to do was I started to look at how these tape loaders worked, and using a couple of tricks and whatnot, it then became my hobby to crack the turbo load mechanisms. In other words, go into the program code, work out what it was doing, and then
so it was actually coming from the code itself. It wasn't a mechanism on the tape.
No, not particularly. It was there was a way of actually cracking them, and I worked out how to do it.
Right.
And then it became my challenge when I got a new turbo load tape. It was my challenge to defeat the protection mechanism on it.
Very interesting.
Which is what I managed to do with most of them.
I've got a question about the Spectrum. Do you see, from what I remember with the Spectrum, is that the graphics were very, very basic for about 5 years, and then they became very complex all of a sudden. So was there a big jump in terms of programming, or conceptually was there a jump there? What exactly changed in terms of why there was such a big jump within the graphics?
There were a number of factors, really. I mean, the early games, such as the ones I did, because I wrote 7 or 8 games in BASIC, and I earned about 125 quid because I sent these games off to somebody who made a compilation tape. Right. They were all written in BASIC, beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code, as the acronym was called then. But the later games were coded in assembler, and it's just that people got to know the machine, they got to know the strengths and weaknesses of the machine from a programmer's perspective, and so they're able to take advantage of the hardware, more in a more optimized way.
Very efficient.
And it then became. Once I'd done the basic games, I started to write a machine code game, but it took a lot longer. And a lot of bedroom coders had come in, and they had more time. I'd gone to university sort of soon after that,
right? So
I didn't have the same amount of time.
These bedroom coders, particularly with, let's say, the conversion of the complex arcade games such as R-Type, would they be bigger teams of individuals, or was it like a 1 or 2 person?
It was typically, in those days, in the 80s, you're still looking at maybe 1 or 2 people, maybe 3 possibly doing the games.
So how would you transfer the graphics to a very complex arcade game such as, Flying Shark or a shoot 'em up?
Well, I never really got involved in that, but I mean, the process, you'd have to basically design your graphics on a piece of graph paper, typically, and work out the binary code which represented those graphics, and then you would have to write some program code to animate it in some way if that's what you were choosing to do.
Would these programmers have access to, let's say, the original code, or would they be using photographs? Because I recall that some of the translations of the games or the conversions were actually very accurate, or seemed to be very accurate to the old arcade games.
I think in those days, really, you didn't have scanners and you didn't have digitizers so much. I think the digitizers, they came in sort of really in the mid to late 80s, and sort of became better and better.
Which I think probably was about the peak of the Spectrum, wasn't it?
The late 80s was was the sort of peak of the Spectrum, really.
So you would have been at university then?
By then, yes.
And I was at school. Well.
Yeah. So it was those times really which gave me an interest in the IT side, which it's turned out to be very important now. Because again, it's the key phrase you used is being self-sufficient. That's what I've been in terms of IT, and having this, like hacking the tapes, as I say, I was able to go into those, unpick those, work out how they worked, and that mentality has stayed the same. That's my mentality. I will go into something, pull it apart, test one bit, see if it breaks, and then from that, work out what's going on. That's what I always try to do. I've got an analytical mind. And at some point, you have to inject some creativity, which tends to come, as I'm sure you'd agree, from the subconscious. So typically, going back to when I was doing these turbo load tape hackings and things, and other things as well, not just that, I'd get so far, I'd think, this is too hard. And then I'd stop, and 2 o'clock in the morning, I'd give up. I'd screw up my notes and chuck them in the bin, and then go to bed. And then the next morning I'd get up, I'd go to the bin, I'd unpick the notes, and that's where I need to do.
I missed something there.
Yeah, I missed something there, and then I'd go in and I'd go forward from there.
So it's a matter of combining the intuitive with the rational side of the mind, the left and the right side of the mind.
And I think I was operating in that manner without consciously trying to operate in that manner. from my mid to late teens.
Yeah.
Really, I think.
You see, I know in terms, because I studied fine arts, and I know in terms of fine arts that there basically wasn't any information about computer artwork, and I certainly, when I look at artists such as Salvador Dali, he anticipated a lot of the type of imagery which we're actually seeing now.
True, yes.
So, and I think artists such as Pablo Picasso, a lot of the work is very obsolete in terms of Picasso's work. It wasn't very forward-looking. It was very much of its time. But Salvador Dali was a genius, and we see a lot of his work reflected in a lot of modern computer animation.
I never thought of that,
but I do think in terms of the university system that they were very blind to what was happening visually in terms of computer artwork. So I think that in itself is quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's it, because things were starting to change in the 80s with that side of things. Some of the early digital art was sort of beginning to get more into the hands of ordinary people. And then particularly, I'll mention it because we're also on the theme of IT and computers, home computers, with the Commodore Amiga, for example, which was I got one of those. I think it was late '88. I got the Commodore Amiga, and that was a wonderful machine. It was like was so massively more powerful than the earlier Spectrum and so forth. And you
was
really
that easy to program?
Well, it was harder to program because it was much more complicated, because you had more complex graphics, you had more complex sound, you had more hardware to be programming. I didn't do a lot of programming on the Amiga. I actually only ended up writing one program on that. And funnily enough, that was when after I got made redundant from the work that I was doing, and I had about 4 weeks where I wasn't actually working. And I ended up writing this Commodore because I'd always wanted to write a program. I'd always wanted to write a program on the Commodore Amiga, but I'd never had the time. So I sat down and I looked at the documentation, and I was able to write this Mastermind game. It was fairly rudimentary, but it sort of allowed me to get out of my system this desire to program the Amiga. Which
and was the Amiga language the same as the Commodore 64 language?
Well, I mean, the languages that you use are almost universal. For example, I wrote the program on the Amiga in the C language. It's just called C, as in the letter C. And that the C language was also available for the Spectrum if you got the right software. So is that the precursor
to C++ then?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it was. And you could have probably done C on the Commodore 64, but I never had a Commodore 64. So, but again, you had assembler language. You could code in assembler on the Amiga if you wished, and I dabbled in that a little tiny bit, not to any great extent. But the assembler language on the Amiga was different to the assembler language on the Spectrum, because it was the Spectrum was an 8-bit processor and the Amiga was a 16-bit processor. So that was all going on in the 80s for me, and I worked at this. I think you're probably going to put in at some point this other short video we did, which is covers some of that. And I ended up leaving university. I went to work for a company called GC Electrical Projects. Moved down to Rugby, Warwickshire. Spent 18 months working there, and that was all programming stuff. We were working on a robot controller, which was actually for factory automation. Part of
so you were actually doing the programming?
Yes, I was, and that was 8086 assembler.
I mean, at this time, this would have been probably very specialised work.
Yeah, more specialised perhaps than it is now, because there's so much more IT-related work.
Do you think that, in a sense, that the UK got ahead of the learning curve with computers because of the ZX?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Spectrum, the Amiga, the Commodores.
There's no doubt about that, and we'll talk about the Raspberry Pi later on, which is relevant to what you just said. But definitely, there was a significant lead. A lot of the games were being developed in the UK. Some of the big software houses, one or two of them have still survived. They became, like, there was, for example, Ocean Software was one of the companies that was developing software.
And these big publishing.
I can't remember who Acclaim were owned by, but Ocean Software, they did all the movie licensing deals in the later years of the Spectrum,
like
and the
Cobra and the Stallone.
They did. I think
Rambo.
they did some of the Rambo films, and they did I think they maybe did some of the early Die Hard films conversions.
Did they start very small, or
they did start quite small, and they
Right.
did that. For example, they bought a license for one film. I can't remember.
and got rich very quickly? Or
They
something
did,
like
and
that?
they paid about. I think they paid about £3,000 for this
Right.
movie license, which of course is buttons, isn't it? Now
Yeah,
it'd be like
yeah.
$10 million for a movie license
Yeah.
for a game. I would think something like that. And that's how they made their money. They did eventually on the Amiga. They did the Batman game when the Batman film came out with Michael Keating.
Yeah.
In 1988, and Kim Basinger or Kim Basinger.
Right.
Ocean did the conversion for that and
Yeah.
stuff. So that that was all part of my world in those days. So I was a bit of a gamer then.
Can I just ask you a question about the Amigas and the Atari STs?
Of course, yeah.
Were they similar, or was the ST
Yes.
just a cheap version? Or
Well, I mean, there's a whole story you can read if you're interested in that sort of thing about what was the cross fertilization between the Amiga and the ST.
were they similar? Were they
Yes.
similar in terms of their power and their?
What the main thing was, they were both 16-bit machines based
Right.
on the 68,000 processor.
Okay.
And the Commodore Amiga really initially trounced the ST because it had these custom chips. It had what they called the Blitter chip.
The Blitter chip.
The Blitter chip, which was this was able to shift graphics around the screen, 16 million pixels a second, I think it was.
Right.
And they had the superior sound chip, and then they had this Fat Agnes chip, and they had the copper processor as well in the Amiga. And those together gave you an entirely different experience on the Amiga to what you got on the ST.
Right.
But with the ST, that gained a lot of the market because it had MIDI interface, this musical instrument digital interface. So that meant you could get a keyboard, plug it in the back of the ST, write a sequence on the ST, and then play that through the keyboard. So there were groups like Ultravox and many of these sorts of groups were using the ST in those days, and it made
So it was an early synthesizer.
Well, it was a sequencer really. You could use it as a MIDI sequencer.
Right.
So that's what the ST was very good at. Some of the games were just pretty good as well, but the Amiga had the edge because it had better graphics hardware.
Okay.
Much of these days, where if you get a standard desktop PC,
Yeah.
you can play a game on it. But
Yeah.
if you get a gaming PC, it'll be a lot better because it's got the gaming.
Yeah. It's designed
graphics
specifically
card,
for that
It's got
function.
the graphics hardware with a multi graphics core and 2 gigabytes, 4 gigabytes of video game memory, video RAM, and so forth. You had an equivalent sort of distinction between the Atari ST and the Amiga, and then they later Atari improved the ST and tried to catch up with the Amiga.
Where does the Archimedes fit into all of this? Because didn't that just come out just after?
It did, yes. Well, I mean that's again a bit of history, which is quite interesting, and we're diverting into IT stuff now. But this is all interesting to me because
it was an extremely expensive computer then in its day,
it was
wasn't it? It was at the top of its...
Yeah, it was pretty expensive. But the thing about the Archimedes was it was sold into education, so it was sold for schools and colleges.
Right, okay.
And
like the BBC computer.
Correct. I never had a BBC because I couldn't afford one. That's why I got the Spectrum, which was about half the price at the time.
They must have been one of the first computers with a floppy...
No. The floppy drives go back to the 70s.
Then you had the Texas Instruments, didn't you? The TI-99-4A.
I didn't have one of those.
Right, I had one of those as a child.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
But that was American.
I think you could get a floppy drive for that.
I think that was an early 16...
No, that was 8-bit. It was an 8-bit machine.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, that was an 8-bit machine in Texas. And that was okay. But yeah, the Archimedes, that was the first RISC-based machine.
Yeah.
Now, why that's noteworthy is Acorn. They designed this machine called the Atom, and then they designed the BBC Micro.
Yeah.
And then at that point, they decided that the way that microprocessors worked, they thought the 16-bit processors, they weren't impressed with the ones that were on the market then.
Right.
So they thought, let's redesign the microprocessor, shall we?
So this 32-bit, was it?
Well, I think it was actually. The ARM was one of the early 32-bit processors, but it worked differently to the other microprocessors.
To its advantage or disadvantage?
To its advantage because it was low power.
Yeah.
It was low power. It was an Acorn RISC machine.
Right.
And they developed this chip themselves. I was watching a video about this the other night, actually.
Yeah.
And they were able to optimize the way that it worked so that it used about a tenth of the power, in terms of electricity, that is, to do the same sort of computation.
Right.
And without going into all the details, I think just about every mobile phone that you have now in the world has an ARM processor in it, or it's a vast number of phones. So you're talking probably hundreds of millions of phones now in the world.
And this is based on
ARM,
Archimedes.
and it's based on the technology which was first built into the Archimedes computer, and then they developed that into a low.
I mean, was the UK
chip.
one of the leading powerhouses in terms of design of computers or processing?
Not really. I mean, that was mainly being done in the US and Japan. I mean, apart from the ARM, there was this other thing which people may remember who are interested in these topics called the transputer, the INMOS transputer. That came out in the late 80s, and that was a powerful because you could link them together, so you could do parallel processing more easily.
Is that a type of computer then?
Well, it's a processor. It was another type of processor. Right. It was designed such that you could link a number of these in an array. So you could have multiple cores working on a problem. But now, like now, we have a dual core, quad core, octa-core processor.
So you could do much more powerful computations.
Right. Yeah. So I was in all of that, and I'm still into that, as you can tell from what I'm talking about now. Yeah. So that was a kind of very much a core element of my life and my professional life as well, because I was doing programming, I was working in technology. Yeah. And then later on I got married. I got married in 1996, and my daughter was born in 1997. Okay. And so at that time I sort of got an offer from somebody to do work at home, because I was working in an office, as many did. Yeah. I was driving about 14 miles, not ever such a long way, but enough to be.
Was you programming that?
Yes, yeah. I was doing more systems integration, a bit less programming, and more kind of taking off the shelf packages by the mid 90s, because a lot of stuff was packaged up by the 90s, and you could just buy components, and it's a bit like that now actually. And you plug these components together. So you have to know what each component does and how it works and what its strengths and weaknesses are. Okay. But in the 90s, I was more involved with systems integration in that job for a couple of years. But then I got another job offer from my friend who I'd known since the 80s. Yeah. And he offered me another programming job again. Right. And that was going to be based at home, or primarily at home. Okay. And that was just before my daughter was born. So I thought, hey,
so that was very convenient.
I can be at home and with my daughter at least some of the time, and I'm not going to be travelling.
What was the product which he was programming?
Well, it was various products. What he was developing was he developed this product which allowed different types of computerized equipment to talk to each other. Right. For example, we did a lot of work for Toshiba because they had systems which controlled factory production lines, such as for food processing, or things like, there was one that I think made a factory that made some type of glue, and typically you'll get a lot of different electronics in there, and you'll get something that might count, it might, for example, count the number of items that are on a conveyor belt, and you might have another machine that kind of brings an arm across to open, a little doorway that things go through or something like that. Right. And what my friend had found in the 80s was that the machine that moved the arm or opened the door would talk a different language to the machine that counted things. And sometimes it was useful to get the counting device to talk to the arm thing, such that, for example, when it counted 100, the door would open and it would do something else. Right. So he designed a little box of electronics. Which would allow the counting thing to talk to the arm moving thing. So
it was a converter of types.
It was called a protocol converter. Right. And he made quite a lot of money out of doing that. Yeah. And then he extended that into work for Toshiba, and he invited me to work for him doing some programming for the Toshiba jobs, which again was...
Was that very different? I mean, did you have to learn a new set of skills?
No, not really. I mean, some of it was mainly still C++. Did some Visual Basic as well then, and we were looking at some of this Toshiba hardware, and that had its own protocol, so you had to understand that. But that was
what was the Japanese software like? Was that any good?
Oh well, the Japanese software was fine. I mean, we had to go and talk to the Japanese, and I had 2 trips out to Japan actually. One was in the year 2000. Yeah. And the other was in 2009.
Which part of Japan did you go
We went to Tokyo. Yeah, it was just Tokyo.
I've been to Tokyo.
Yeah. And so I was spent a week there in 2000, and I think we were there for about 4 days in 2009. And
so how was it to do business with the Japanese? They're very astute, aren't they?
Oh yeah. No, they were very, very, very sort of
polite
good,
and accommodating.
Yeah, very respectful, and we got on very well. But my friend Paul, he was he'd been working with them for years, so they got a very good working relationship with them by then. So I just fitted into that really.
Yeah.
So we also went out to South Korea as well. I actually went out there on my own for a job there, because he had one of these protocol conversion units.
So let me get this right. You were then doing the programming for the units?
Yes, exactly, or some of it. Yeah, he did some and I did some.
Right, so you would just split it up between the two of you.
Yeah, and I was... He'd written his...
This is very difficult or technical in terms of only a few people knew how to do this.
Right. I mean, that's why he asked me to work for him, because he knew, having worked with me previously...
You'd be pedantic and you would learn...
Right. Well, he knew that I knew how to do stuff, and I'd done a little job. In fact, before I worked for him, he asked me to do a little job for him, and he paid me a couple of £100 or something for it. And I did that to his satisfaction, so he knew that I was able to do that programming work. And so we worked on that, and we had another guy that worked with us called Ken, and we did a few Toshiba factories in the UK. That was in the 90s now, sort of 1999, 2000 time frame.
I mean, has this changed in terms of the technology, or is it what he established, is that still the basic?
I think it's probably moved on now, because the work that we were doing with Paul in the 90s was basically PC replacement, because the Toshiba systems, they came out in the late 1980s when the early IBM PCs would come out. Yeah. And Toshiba had their own customised version of the IBM PC, which they used to sell as part of their factory control system.
Did they use different sort of programming language? Was there a problem in terms of...
No, they used essentially they used the same programming languages. They had some customised hardware. Yeah. And then in the factory, for example, the operators could go in, they'd have an IBM PC or Toshiba's version of that with a colour screen, and they'd see these little graphics of a tank filling up with water or fluid or whatever, and then they could press something on the keyboard and set the next part of the process, or empty the tank or whatever, or reset it so that it would empty after it was half full rather than 3/4 full or whatever. Yeah. But those PCs, you see, they had a lifetime of about 10 years, because they'd been on 24 hours a day for 10 years. Yeah. So the hard drives were going, the screen was all cruddy, and they used customised hardware. So Paul, he'd developed this thing where they could plug their Toshiba control hardware, which controlled the actual plant, into a standard Dell PC. And
making their machines redundant.
So that they could take out the old PCs with all the crappy old screens that had worn out, and the tubes had gone in the TV monitors, and the hard drives had gone, and they just replace them with a Dell PC, a standard Dell PC or a Toshiba PC or whatever they wanted. Right. And we just provided them with this little communications box. Yeah. And then we put some software onto the PC which reproduced the functions of the stuff that had gone in the bin. Right. So I got involved with some of the communication software and with what's called the user interface software, which is where you get these gauges going up and down and the tanks filling up and that. So I got involved with some of that as well.
And just out of interest, in terms of that code, did you have to rewrite that code? Or
that was a complete rewrite. We couldn't use any of the Toshiba hardware.
Right. And was it just because it was obsolete?
Yeah, I mean, it worn out. It's physically. Yeah. And you couldn't get replacement parts because they no longer manufactured them. Yeah. And the PCs might have had 256 kilobytes of memory, whereas the more modern ones would have had 3 or 4 times that. Right. So so that was all going on in my life in the 90s. Yeah. Occasional trips to sites around the UK with these Toshiba replacements. Yeah. But we knew, Paul had said to me when I got that work that it would perhaps last 6 months. I think in the end it lasted about 4.5, 5 years. Okay. That lasted. And then I formed my own company, and I was effectively doing software consultancy really, and most of it was still being done for Paul, but I had a couple of other people that were giving me work as well. doing programming work and systems integration type work.
Was that successful as a company?
Well, I mean, I was able to make a living from doing it.
Okay.
But I didn't try and sort of build it up into a business. I'm not like that.
No.
I'm not commercially or business minded, as people will probably know.
You were more interested in just solving the problems rather than...
Correct. Yeah, that's what. Exactly. And that was my bent was to.
Well, by the sound of it, your friend was more interested in making money. Yeah.
Well, no, he wasn't. He had good business sense.
Yeah. He also had an inquiring mind, because by the sounds of it, he was far ahead of the learning curve.
Well, he's what I'd call an entrepreneur.
Right.
I think going back to more towards the subjects that people are interested in terms of the paranormal type stuff. He had no interest in that at all.
Right,
I mean, in later years, because I did do some work for him.
Yeah.
In 2009 was the last bit of work I really did for him.
Right.
I was well into all the stuff that we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah.
And he had no interest in that, despite knowing me. He'd known me for 20 years.
Yeah.
But he had no interest
Very
in that.
Very practically minded.
Yeah. And he's just kind of a slave to the system, really.
Right. Okay.
He's a lovely guy, and he helped me enormously professionally.
Yeah.
And he was very generous to me professionally. Yeah. But outside of that, we didn't have a lot in common outside of the professional interests that we had, and so forth.
So tell me a little bit about, let's say, your interest in the paranormal. I mean, where's your earliest memory where you were, let's say, interested in or thinking about the paranormal? I mean, does it go all the way back to early childhood, or
more or less? As I think I
Right.
sent you the other day, the sighting that I had, the first UFO sighting I had was in 1974. I think it would have been 74 or 75. I think 74. I'd say something like September, October. I can't remember the exact date.
Yeah.
And we had a youth club that's connected to the primary school I went to, St Stephen's Primary School in Skipton. They used to run a youth club up at the convent. Yes, Catholic boy. I was a Catholic boy, everybody. Brought up Roman Catholic. And we used to have this youth club on a Friday night, and they used to play, pop music, and you'd have a little tuck shop.
You'd been about 10 then.
I was about 10,
Right.
and we'd dance around, play some, maybe play a little sort of table football or something like that with the kids that were there, a bit of ping pong or something like that. And then we came out probably about 9 o'clock at night, and it was dark by then, so it was probably September, October, and just coming down the steps, looking out, probably. Would have been thinking of the direction sort of to the southeast, I would think. Yeah. In Skipton, this is. And I saw these two stars doing acrobatics. Right. And then sort of flying like this. Yeah. They were flying like that around each other.
Sort of very erratic.
And sort of erratic, and I thought... And I'd as we mentioned, I had an interest in astronomy as well as the technical. The astronomy actually came before all the computing stuff. Yeah. I got a book on astronomy when I was about 8 or 9 years old that somebody gave me, and I was fascinated by it. Always have been.
So you instantly knew that this wasn't astronomical.
So I knew what a shooting star was. Yeah. I knew what a comet was.
Yeah.
I knew what a plane looked like when it was flying through. I knew it wasn't any of those. Yeah. No doubt. There was another a girl with me, Catherine McKenna. She was in my class. She saw. I know that she saw it. We didn't speak about it a lot when we were 10 years old, for heaven's sake. Yeah. But she did see it. I remember her acknowledging in some way that she'd seen it. Right. And then these things just went off into the distance, and that was that. Went home and.
I mean, had you before that because of your interest in astronomy? Had you considered flying saucers, or was that something you were not really interested in?
Well, it was at least a little bit, because I can't remember the exact timescale, but somebody had bought me this book called Space, Fact and Fiction. Yeah. Which I believe had some pages. It was a children's book. It wasn't an adult book. And it had a little bit about astronomy and the solar system in a very sort of simple terms, Yeah. And it had something, as I recall, about the George Adamski case in it. Right. So it was mixing together some of the astronomy stuff and the UFO stuff. So I do remember that looking at that book. Yeah. That sort of age, 9, 10, 11, that sort of age.
And it resonated.
It resonated in some way. Yeah, it gave me an interest in that. At least, that's an interesting thing. Let's keep that in the back of my mind for later.
Did it have just out of interest? Did that have a profound effect on you? The sighting?
Not really, and I don't recall it being. I just thought, that's pretty unusual. So
it was just more of a curiosity.
Curiosity, surprise, that sort of thing. It wasn't like, wow, that means it must be aliens. No, it wasn't like that at all.
It was just inexplicable.
Just inexplicable, an interesting thing to see. You know, I don't even remember talking about it with my family. It didn't seem significant enough to me to talk about with my family. Maybe I did, but heck, it's, you know,
it was like a footnote.
It was a footnote, exactly. Yeah. So there was that going on. I had another friend at school, Damien. He actually lives in Skipton. He lives in Empsey, not too far from here. Right. He was quite interested, and we used to read ghost books. We had these. I was telling somebody about these. We used to read the Aidan Chambers books, the Great British Ghosts, and ghost stories of, you know, the last 100 years or something. Yeah. And I remember we got these from some book club or something, and we swapped them. And we would share them, Damien and I. And we had a book of Monsters and Mysterious Beasts. I think I had that when I was about 9 years old. We got that from this Chip Club thing, which was a book club that we had at school. So
here there's a wide range of strange phenomena.
Right. And that, you know, my parents didn't force that on me. That was just something, and my family, they were neutral about it. You know, they weren't disinterested. They weren't anti it. But they weren't actively saying, "Oh, Andrew, you know, look at this."
Was anyone else in your family who was very interested in these type of questions?
No, I mean, not really. I mean, they would have a conversation about it, but they wouldn't go out and buy a UFO book particularly. Yeah. Right, okay. My brother had a slight interest. Okay. Two of my brothers, I suppose, and maybe I'm being a bit unfair. And in fact, that probably brings us on to the first prop. Yeah. And I have a feeling that I got this off one of my brothers. I think I stole it. I think this was probably Tony's, I think.
The Flying Saucer Menace.
The Flying Saucer Menace, yeah. And I'm not even sure what this... Let's see, I'll have to get my glasses on here and I'll see if I can read the cover. But this had been knocking about in a bookcase or something. I had this in the loft, actually. Yeah. It says text by Brad Steiger, who a name I know now. Yeah. Had award special $1. And I was shocked to see that this was printed in 1967. So that I can't have bought this because I was 3 years old then. So this must have come from my brother Tony. And it's got, in fact, you can see there's a picture of a dam skull. Hold that up to the camera there. I think we might have shown this before. So that was from an early. That was from, I don't know where that was probably on the bookshelf, I suppose. Whether I actually read it when I was a certain age. So that was in the house. Probably my brother Tony's, who you know, was probably more interested than everyone else. But he was kind of a skeptic. He still is a skeptic. Okay. But so there was that factor. Maybe it was more significant than I realised.
So do you have interesting debates with your brother Tony then?
I have had. Yeah. I don't talk about it much with him now, but my eldest brother, he's very argumentative, and I have had some quite heated debates with him in the past. Right. But that was probably back in sort of 2003 time frame, which we'll come on to in a bit.
Just out of interest, so what's the nature of the debate? Was it just that where's your proof, where's your evidence?
Well, he really just says he doesn't know.
Okay. It's a fair position.
It is a fair position, but I was wanting to move from the state of doubt into a state of certainty. When we were having this debate, which was in 2003, which again we'll probably come on to a bit more in the circumstances of how that arose, and that's been one of my goals. In what I've been doing generally is to help people if they want to make that transition, to make that transition from doubt into certainty about certain topics. And you can't do it all the time. Yeah. But that and as I've realised now, that's actually one of the key fundamental things is moving yourself from a state of doubt to a state of certainty. That to me is a fundamental thing, so which causes
away from neutrality, basically,
which causes a transition in the way that you actually interact with the world
and perceive the world.
And perceive the world, indeed, yes.
And does that have a knock-on effect then, you think?
I think so. Maybe we'll talk about that a bit later, because I think we're sort of skipping ahead of the way of my thought processes, as it were.
Okay.
So talking about the UFO stuff, as we're now getting onto that topic. And the reason why we're going to show the other video, if you put that in with me on the table there, which we're going to talk where I was talking, and that kind of brings us onto this, because so we've got the 80s, me growing up in the 80s, going to school, the UFO sighting, my interest in that. Yeah. So I decided to do this general studies project, because I did general studies A level. What you do general studies A level? Well, you do an exam. I think you did 2 papers for the exam, and then there was a third component which was 30 or 40% of the marks, which was a project.
Okay.
And fantastic, you can do whatever the hell you like, more or less, within reason. And so I chose to do a project which I gave the title of Close Encounters of the Extraterrestrial Kind, Hallucination, Imagination or Fact. And of course I got the title from the Spielberg film, which came out in 1977, so you've got all that stuff kicking about in my consciousness. So how did that go
down with the teacher?
Well, they were fine with it, they had no problem, absolutely no problem. And as it was, my English teacher, Mr. Jones, as he was called, and he also taught me Latin for 4 years. I did Latin for 4 years. Can you believe that? That's part of before we had to do 4 years of each O-level subject before we switched. And he knew that I was doing this project, and he came up to me one day after class, or was in class, and said, "Oh, Johnson, you're doing this project." I was, I'm quite interested in it. Oh, he says, you need to go and see this chap that lives across the road from me. He says he's got the weirdest stories. He really has got the weirdest stories. And I could see on Mr. Jones's face, just by his expression, that he was genuinely didn't know. He was quite perplexed, almost frightened. I could see that. My reading of him at that time was, he's actually been frightened by what this chap's told him.
Right.
And so I went to. I arranged me to meet with his neighbour or his guy across the road. And that, of course, was Mr. Tony Dodd,
right? Okay,
who was the police sergeant working for West Yorkshire Police. So when I got to know him, or I got to meet him, I didn't really get to know him.
Yeah,
I went to see him twice, I think.
I know his book focuses on animal mutilation and human mutilation as well. Yes, and that doesn't really get much coverage within ufology.
No. I mean, he was covering some of the taboo subjects. He was
far ahead of many
I think he was.
researchers.
And he was very kind. Obviously my English teacher was settled the meeting, so I went to his house. His wife was there, let me in, and he was very kind. He explained to me how he got involved. Yeah. And I remember him telling me this account of when it. And I think he's written this in his book, and I haven't read his book, shockingly, but I haven't read his book. I'm not a big book reader, actually, to be brutally honest. A lot of the stuff I've done is all from online materials and so forth. But anyway, so
sorry, I was just thinking in terms of being online. Do you think that's because your brain works with lots of disparate information that you feel quite
maybe partly? I've always, because I've worked with technology since I left school, essentially.
So it's a very natural way of working.
Yeah, it's very natural to me. It's my sort of much more natural for me to be in that environment.
Sorry, tell me about what you were going to say about.
Yeah, so Tony Dodd. So I met with him, and that would have been probably sort of 1982, maybe early 83. It's probably going to be, it would have been probably 82 though. And I went to his house, and he explained to me that he'd had this sighting when I think it was either on Carlton Moor or Ilkley Moor. And I was talking to David Caton the other day. I was with David Caton, and he said he thought it was Connolly, which is not ever so far from where we are now. Carlton Moor above Connolly, was it right? Okay. Thanks, Anthony. And so he'd seen this light coming down, and he wondered what it was. Yeah. And I think he was out, again, Anthony might correct me on this, but he was out a couple of nights later or a week later or something, and he saw the same light again. But this time, I distinctly remember him telling me this, and it's probably in his book, which I haven't read. He got his torch out, and he signalled to it. He made some type of hand signal, and the thing flashed back at him. And he thought, wow. And that was I think was in 1978. So this was obviously 4 years before I'd met him.
So instantly, that tells you that there's an intelligence behind whatever it is.
That's what it looks like, doesn't it? When you get that sort of response.
Was that the pivotal moment for him to become
I think
interested?
It was. Right. And so he told me about that, how he'd got involved, and I think I did. It's a shame I couldn't find this project. I've probably shoved it in a drawer somewhere. I don't think I've chucked it out, because I'd like to have read that out. That if he gave me his account, I can't even remember whether I included it. Yeah. But
well, if you do find it, we could perhaps include it with the
if we get a chance. I'll can send
you'll
some
read it out, or if you can film that and send it through, and we can edit
If I do find it, I'm not sure where it is, but anyway. So he told me that, and then he told me about this contactee case he was involved with. Yeah. And so he gave me some information about that. He had this sort of journal which he had.
Yeah.
Gave me that, and it was about a woman called Christine who'd been in a car.
Yeah.
And the car had lifted off the road.
Right.
And then she'd undergone hypnosis.
This journal had been compiled by him and researched.
I don't know. I think he'd contributed to it. The journal was, as I remember, was called Contact.
Okay.
But I can't remember much more about it than that.
Right.
So he gave me some on that. He told me about the Adamski case, not the 1950s
what was his take
one.
on the Adamski case?
Not the 1950s one.
Oh, right, okay.
This was another Adamski.
Right, okay.
And it was the guy who was in Todmorden.
Right.
And this was quite a well-known case because the police got involved.
Yeah.
And this was the Adamski case, I think, in 1980. So it was a couple of years before I'd met Tony.
Yeah.
And this chap, I forget his first name, it wasn't George.
He was Polish, wasn't he?
Correct.
Yeah.
And he went out, the story was he'd gone out to buy potatoes.
Yeah.
And then he didn't come back. And his wife eventually called the police. And then he was found dead on top of a coal tip.
Yeah.
2 or 3 or 4 days later.
Yeah.
And he had the back of his head shaved.
Yeah.
And he had some jelly-like substance on his skin.
Yeah.
And the coroner was called out, and that was all investigated. And the coroner who was on that case, he was interviewed by Michael Aspel, or by somebody working for Michael Aspel, on the Strange But True programme. I think it was in their first programme from about 92. And he said, and I think this was on YouTube, but it might still be. He said, if somebody were to tell me that aliens were involved in this case, I would only raise half an eyebrow.
Right,
That's what he said.
Yeah. So it was an extremely unusual case.
It was an extremely unusual case.
By his standards. And I'm sure that being a coroner, he would have seen lots of unusual cases.
Yeah. And that I remember putting that case in my project. I wrote that up in my general studies project, among other things that Tony told me.
Yeah, because I think I've got a feeling, was Tony actually on that case?
I'm not sure. I think he probably had some inside knowledge because it was investigated by the police.
I've got a feeling, if I remember correctly, because I did read the book.
The first policeman on site was actually policeman Alan Godfrey.
Godfrey.
Ah, so he was... Oh, right, yeah,
weren't the police officers actually looking at strange lights? I'm sure that there's an anecdotal story about before they were actually called to the scene of what was potentially a crime, or that's how they perceived it, that they were actually looking at strange lights in the sky.
Yeah, I think that's right, because they thought... Yeah, I believe...
I think also what was quite unusual about the case, which they said, was that they couldn't see because he was on top of a big coal stack, and it appeared like he'd just been placed
exactly. There were no, if you walk up a coal tip, I remember Tony telling me this as well. If you walk up a coal tip, you'll see your feet push down the sort of things.
And that would have been useful to determine was it 1 or 2 people?
People, exactly. Yeah.
What was the weight of the individuals? Were they heavy set, etc. So I think that in itself is quite... And again, his clothing didn't have coal dust on, so it didn't look like he'd been dragged up there. So it was extremely
quite clean,
unusual.
Yeah, it was. And that, I think, was also associated... I remember Tony, I think he told me about the case where there was some cattle in a field and lights were seen over the field. Yeah. And then somehow the cattle had got out onto the road and the gate had been opened. But they'd been able to determine that the gate had been closed. Right. But somehow it mysteriously become open and the cattle got out, and he told me about that case. And I think that was also connected to the Alan Godfrey case, which became a real...
Did you ever meet Godfrey?
No, I never met Alan Godfrey. Right. But there's something very, very strange went on with his case. I have no doubt about that.
Do you think that was just a one-off experience, or do you think it continued throughout his life?
I have no idea. Yeah. I have no idea.
Because basically, there is a famous account where obviously he saw the UFO and he had some kind of contact with strange beings. But for me, because obviously with many of these cases, there seems to be an ongoing contact with many of these beings, and that for me would be an interesting question. I think he's passed away now, though, hasn't he?
No, I don't know. I think he's alive and kicking.
Right, that would be something quite interesting to find out.
Maybe you better go and interview him.
Yeah, well, but maybe so. Yeah,
I don't know if he lives. I think he's probably not that far away from here. I don't know where he lives now, but I don't think he's ever so far away from here.
Right. Okay.
I think he might live in Halifax or something. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Right.
So Tony Dodd, lovely guy, helped me. But I did the project, and that was it, really. I mean, just to show you, I was showing these on the other video that we did, but just to mention, like Bufora Bulletin, But I've since
Was you a
found
signed up member to Buffalo?
No, I just found their address in a magazine or something, or in the library, and I just said, "Oh, can you send me some stuff for my project?"
Right.
And they just sent me this, and Jenny Randalls is on the cover of this one, so that's September '82, as I think I showed on the other video.
Right.
But I've since realised that they're just a debunking organisation. Really, they're not. Okay, they've collected some useful information, but they're not interested in the bigger picture, which we haven't really got onto yet.
Is it debunking, or is it just kind of overly sceptical?
Well, perhaps that's fair. Perhaps it's overly sceptical, but certainly Clark and Roberts, who I think were Bufora members. Sorry to swear on camera, but they're definitely debunkers. I don't have any qualms in saying that. So yeah, and then there was like this journal of aerial phenomena, transient aerial phenomena and stuff.
Right.
I think possibly Tony gave me that.
It's quite an interesting term, isn't it? Transient aerial.
Yeah.
Phenomena.
Oh look, I've just found this in the back. Gosh, wow, that dates it.
Yeah.
Dear Mr. Johnson, in reply to your letter of 5th of October, I enclosed copies of some Bufora publications and also 2 book lists, which I hope you may be of some use to you. PMA Kennedy, is it? I think Miss Honorary Membership Secretary, and that's from it is Kennedy. 13th of October 1982. There you are.
Right, 82.
So that's a bit of history. Gosh, I didn't know that was there. So yeah. So that's there you go. And really, sort of, I'd read the odd book through the 90s, but I was working then. And
I mean, just out of interest, are there any books which really stand out, or researchers which really redefined your paradigm about?
Not so much then. I mean, that I suppose there's like this. I'd become aware in we'll answer that question in a minute, just to follow the timeline, as it were, because that's my linear logical programmer's brain at work.
I'm all over the place. I'm a very lateral thinker.
And so so 90s, didn't do much. Read maybe one book. I think I had a book called Phenomena, which I got from one of these stupid book clubs that you sign up for. Right. They send you a book a month, and you think, why the hell have I signed up for this? I'm never going to read these books. Right. That's because they offered you 6 books for £1 each. And that's cheap. And so I got a UFO book, I think, from there, and I think I read that in the 90s. Didn't really. I found out about the Rendlesham case. I'd learned a little bit about that in the 90s, not much. Yeah. I didn't read the Larry Warren book or anything like that. No. So really, we're going straight across the most of the 80s and 90s in terms of the paranormal interest. Really, nothing much doing for me.
So it was an undercurrent. A subtle interest.
Yeah. And then it was really what kicked me off, because I was working at home. Yeah. And by this time I'd moved to my current house in Borrowash. And we got broadband internet. I've told this story many times on other interviews. I'm going a bit further back in history with this interview. And it was when I got broadband internet. Yeah. 2003, April, May time. And BBC had one of these sort of not too bad, as I recall, documentaries. Yeah. And it was about the Rendlesham case. It was called Britain's Closest Encounters, I think, was the title of the documentary. Right. And it had featured an interview, I think, with Colonel Holt and Larry Warren, I think.
So the principal players within
I think case. So, yeah. 1 or 2 of those. And there was something that made me curious to find out more. I thought, that Rendlesham case. I heard that there was a crash there. Yeah. And then I heard that there wasn't actually a crash, it was a landing. So what was that all that about? Yeah. So I'd got my broadband internet by then.
See, I've never heard of that idea that there was a crash there.
No. But, well, of course, they've got the books by Ronnie Kinsella and the one by Jenny Randalls. It's actually called Sky Crash. That's in the title, isn't it? Right. So I don't know where they got that Sky Crash idea from. But so I'd heard that it described as a crash.
Don't Tell the People. I think
that was Georgina Bruni's book. Yeah, so I've read that.
Was that a quotation from Margaret Thatcher?
Yeah, correct. Very good book, that, by the way.
Yeah, it was.
People want to read. Yeah. Anyway, so I'd watched this documentary. Rendlesham case. What's that Rendlesham case? What's that? Is there anything about that? Is it real? Is it not real? And that's when I found the Disclosure Project. I went onto my broadband search thing, always on internet.
Greer, are we talking
Greer,
about?
correct. We're talking about Greer. And so May 2003, put in, Rendlesham forest incident into Google, and then at some point on the page or in my searches, Disclosure Project. what's this Disclosure Project? What's that? I never heard of that. And then I found the press conference that Greer had done in 2001 at the National Press Conference Club.
Right.
And I thought, what's this? Was it a video? 2 hours long?
Was that with Podesta?
No, he wasn't in that.
Right, okay.
Not at that time.
Right.
He came out a bit later on. And I'm thinking, 2 hours long? Oh, that's that video. Look, 70 megabytes. Oh, that's a bit big. Oh, I'm on my broadband though, so I can download it.
Right.
So I think this video was like 70, 80 megabytes or something.
Yeah.
So I downloaded that. 2 hours of witness testimony.
Did that really blow your mind?
It kind of did, really.
Blew the lid off.
Yeah, that kind of blew the lid off because I'm not saying I believed every word of it, but I thought, this is the National Press Conference Club. This is a prestigious venue.
Yeah.
They had a lot of journalists there.
Yeah.
They had questions from the journalists.
Yeah.
But the thing was the witnesses. They had 21 witnesses.
Yeah.
John Callahan, Captain Robert Salas,
Yeah.
Graham Bethune,
Yeah.
Don Phillips. Greer himself was clearly an intelligent speaker, a very knowledgeable man.
Yeah.
And who else stood out in my mind?
So what is your opinion about Greer? Because I know he gets mixed reviews.
We'll come on to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's something wrong with him now. Maybe there wasn't. Well, there probably was then, but he's certainly not telling us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Greer has an agenda.
Is it that the disclosure has been hijacked, or was it always the purpose to direct us into a certain conclusion or a certain?
I think it was kind of. Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe talk about that a bit later because. That
it's quite a big subject.
Yeah, and I think if I describe that my sort of path, people that are listening may find they've had a similar path, but perhaps somewhat accelerated in terms of my path, which is.
Do you think things are speeding up? In terms of consciousness,
because of the technology. Yeah, because of the access to information.
But you see, the technology is just an expression of the human mind and consciousness. Arguably, there are other influences as well which are driving the technology.
Yeah. But going back to the Disclosure Project and these high caliber witnesses, I later discovered that some of them perhaps a bit dodgy, right? Although nice enough people. And at that point, then you see. I thought, wow, I've got to tell people about this. I found this in 2003, but it was already 2 years old. In fact, it was just about 2 years old.
Right.
I thought, as I said on other interviews, this is so big.
But it didn't
and
really...
I'd not heard anything about this.
Yeah.
I went and searched on the BBC website, and indeed, I found a reference to it. Okay. Disclosure Project 2001, and the headline was. UFO spotters ask for investigation or something like that.
Right, okay.
And I watched the conference by then. I found the story after watching the conference. I thought, these are not UFO spotters. This guy was in charge of a flipping nuclear weapons installation. That's not a UFO spotter.
It kind of makes out the idea that this is just a hobby or something like that, isn't it?
Correct.
Of amateurs.
Right.
When these are actually military personnel. And
Exactly. So the calibre of the witnesses and the way that it was put together was beyond what I was ever expecting to encounter at that point.
I mean, at this point, in terms of, let's say, you accepting mainstream news, I mean, did you pretty much accept the construct at this point?
Pretty much. I was still following mainstream news.
So you were very disappointed in terms of the reporting from the BBC?
Sure. I mean, in fact, I knew once again, it's going from this state of doubt to knowledge.
Yeah. Did you think, gosh, that's an inconsistency there, that's incongruous, so why is that occurring?
Yeah, kind of, but specifically what I'd realised then, and I knew then, I'd always suspected that there was a cover-up of the UFO stuff, stories, technology, whatever.
What, ever since your project?
Doing the project and all the stuff I'd read there and bits and stuff. I'd always suspected there was a cover-up. Yeah. But by watching that Disclosure Project, I knew because that was such a significant event. It hadn't been covered. Yeah. And I knew there was a cover-up. And the other big thing, which Greer is essentially kind of, it may, I don't know, he's kind of backpedaled from this as he made the link, which is key in all of this, between free energy and flying saucers. Yeah,
and that is a very big...
Yeah, because I've been interested in that as well. In fact, as I've said on some of the other interviews, when I got my first internet connection in 1996, the dial-up, the slow dial-up that we all had then, when people had it, what did I go looking for? Stuff on cold fusion, which is an energy phenomenon. I'd
Right.
printed out loads of pages, so I
Yeah.
didn't have to stay online and run up the phone bill at that time. And I'd whatever happened to cold fusion? And that was in '97 that I was looking at there, because this cold fusion is this nuclear energy phenomenon. For those that are not familiar,
Is that
with
where
this.
you pass electric current into water and then you...
Kind of, it's deuterated water. It's an electrolysis experiment, essentially.
Yeah, electrolysis.
And that became very, very important later on. Very important.
Because it became very big, and then it was almost like this experiment shows that it's possible to obtain large amounts of energy from water, and then suddenly, oh no, it doesn't, because it can't be reproduced. But obviously, there were people who were reproducing the experiment around the world.
So, in other words, you had a similar type of cover-up.
Yeah.
In that, yes.
Well, do you think that okay, I mean, obviously, there does seem to be a cover-up there, but do you think it was that the experiment was very difficult to reproduce, or was it was very easy to reproduce and they were just simply lying about it?
I think it was relatively easy to reproduce, and they were mostly lying about it.
Okay.
From what I've understood, from what I've read, the researchers hadn't published anything at the time, and so the information to reproduce it wasn't in the public domain, so they weren't able to reproduce it. The ones who reported that they weren't able to reproduce it because they didn't know how to do it. They hadn't got all the details that Fleischmann.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So there was a factor of that, but the Pons and Fleischmann, I think, perhaps did want to keep it close to their chests at first, maybe for the first year.
Yeah.
But after the first year, when they were getting attacked, I would imagine they were less reluctant to give people more information about how they did it.
Yeah.
And there were a number of reproductions, and I still get that today, that they'll say, "Oh, it was never reproduced." Well, it was.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of documentation and scientific papers, I say plenty, a fair few, that show that.
Yeah.
And so the cover-up of energy, to me, was analogous to the cover-up of UFOs. And then when Greer came out at this press conference, and I think he says it quite early on, he said something along the lines of, why you don't know about UFO stuff is because it's to do with energy. And his simple point, I forget the exact phrase that he used, was think about the propulsion. We know these things are coming here. You've got tons of evidence that they come here, despite what you hear in the news.
Yeah.
So how are they coming here? Are they using, I've said this many times in the talks.
They're not using rocket fuel, are they?
They're not using rocket fuel. They're not using uranium.
Yeah.
They're using something else.
Yeah.
And that is why we have the cover-up, because the something else is the important thing.
And if you think about it, water must be one of the most common elements in the universe.
Well, yes, and there are even reports of UFOs actually sucking up water, aren't there? There's one particular account I'm thinking of in Ingo Swan's book, in the Penetration book, where he describes being taken to this sort of lake or lagoon, and a flying saucer materialises and sucks up the water from the lake.
Yeah,
and
I've come across UFOs connected to reservoirs.
Right.
So
yeah.
There is that connection.
So in other words, that was a real key moment in my life when I got to that point, and I then actually literally.
But are we just dealing here with a conspiracy which is 50 years old, or are we dealing with something which is much older?
Ultimately, I'd say it's older, and I think
because from my research, and I'm just quickly going to interject here.
Mm-hmm.
My research shows that there's a correlation between what is described as the classified tradition, which comes from the etymology of classical. Now, classical means classicus. Classical comes from the etymology meaning naval, and that which is naval relates to the angels, because Malak, an angel, is Malak, a sailor, and they were referred to as being aliens. Tsar, which is an alien, is also an angel, so the terms are interchangeable. So the classified tradition is the classical tradition, and it's very ancient. And when I've looked into research such as Plutarch wrote what is famously known as the Parallel Lives, which refers to very famous people within history who are, if you like, interconnected to this angelic or alien bloodline. The two terms are synonymous. Now, I refer to this in holographic culture, which I'm writing at the moment. This is a parallel society. So I think it's quite different from, let's say, other researchers such as Dolan, who talks about the breakaway society. Here, what we're actually dealing with is a parallel society. And I think that a lot of the material on ufology has been an attempt to try and take this away from this idea that this parallel culture is actually interacting with humans. But this then this classified secret goes back into classical antiquity. So I think this is really essentially what we're dealing with, the complexity of.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could certainly make an argument that and this kind of goes back to, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea, for example, that we see UFOs today and we describe them as spaceships of some kind. I know that's a very sort of crass way of putting it, and then we hear that, well, in the 1800s they were described as airships, or before that they were described as balls in the sky or something. In other words, we have this parallel.
Well, it's an ancient word because in the Greeks they
we're expressing in our language the common sort of modern day thing, which is an equivalent of what we're seeing, if you see what I mean. So we're describing it as spaceships now because we've had spaceships since the 60s sort of thing, but before that we didn't really have them.
Well, if you won't know this, but the angels were also referred to as the Ben Sira, who's the son of a boat. Sira is a wordplay also on Sira, which is Sirius. So that's quite interesting that they were making a connection between the son of a boat, which would be Malak an angel, or Malak a sailor. Again, if we look at the Judaic word, Yahweh Sabaoth, Sabaoth, the Lord of the host, translates, it is a derivation from Sevet, which is a crew member of a naval vessel. So the idea that they are sailors is a very ancient idea, and I think often in modern ufology it is just thought that the spaceship is just a modern construct, which of course it's not. It's very ancient and it goes back into an occult tradition. Hence, within Greek symbolism, for example, you have the shield. Opalon, a shield, is related to Pleion, which is a boat or a ship. So the shield, or the flying shield, is seen as a ship or a vessel. And that's quite interesting when you go into the Roman mysteries, because it was argued with the Romans. Newman, for example, protected this shield, and it was always said that whoever would find this shield, which had fallen from heaven, would be the dominant culture on the earth. And so this is an ancient, if you like, this is an ancient story of a crashed UFO, which goes into the ancient mysteries.
I mean, I'm not aware of things like that. So
but it's obscure information.
So I mean, you can make an argument that as you say, maybe the spaceship isn't a modern concept at all, but and I suppose one might look at the whole ancient alien paradigm and consider certain factors of that. But I suppose, I mean, the way that we use language to describe the phenomenon has probably been manipulated heavily, in the ways that
it can enlighten, but it can also restrict as well our understanding or concept of what this phenomenon actually is, or what it entails.
And I suppose me again, going back to my technological sort of bent and side, I'm always, that is my lens that I look onto this, and I look at the suppressed technology, and that's always been one of my my main focus, I suppose. And because of what that leads on to in what I found out later.
Is this technology, such as the microprocessor, is this technology gradually filtering through? Do you think that there's a connection there with...
Well, I'm still unsure whether there is an example, there is an argument, for example, about where the transistor came from. Some people say that the transistor, as was invented by Shockley and Bardeen, or Bradeen, I always get the second one's name wrong, 1947,
right?
And if you look at their lab notes, for example, some people claim that this transistor sort of came out of nowhere, and others will then say that yes, well, actually, what they were given was information from the Roswell crash, which allowed them to put these two materials together, silicon and germanium, I think, or something.
Right. So it was a bizarre combination of materials, which
they'd not thought of before, and they were given information to do that. I don't know whether that's true.
Okay.
But some people have said...
So it's difficult to account for the history of...
Some would say there's an argument for that.
I mean, what about things like television? Because when you think about it, it's a very obscure and very difficult technology to actually conceive of.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure about that because... again, you look at the work of John Logie Baird and his early work on television, which used some type of rotating disc of lenses. You can see there is a history to that. It certainly didn't come out of nowhere.
So isn't there the Fourier? Am I thinking of some kind of... anyway, it was some kind of mathematical formula.
Fourier transform.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm out
of my depth. I'll be honest, I'm out of my depth here. I'm not.
I don't know. I mean, I've not really looked into where the Fourier transform came from. You can certainly make arguments that there are things like that which are so far ahead of what everyone else is doing. Like Dirac, for example, the physicist Dirac, and some of the stuff that he came out with. and some of the stuff on
what did Dirac come out with?
Field effect transistor. He was looking at the way that the electron. He was looking at something to do with electrons, and he came out with all this mathematics about electrons, which enabled them to, I think, ultimately do certain things with semiconductors.
Yeah.
And things like you had field effect transistors, which were created FETs, and then MOSFETs, which things like that. You know, you look at some of that and you think, whoa, that's a pretty big technological jump. And some people have argued that there was, external input into that. I don't know, frankly.
Yeah.
I think it's possible.
Also, it raises interesting questions about consciousness and whether that consciousness itself can be intercepted.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, for example, not so much on the electronics technology, but DNA, the story about Francis Crick, and he's written about it in his book, in that he'd been looking at the structure of DNA, but he finally worked out the structure after he was on an LSD trip. He was on an LSD trip, and then within that trip, he saw the double helix structure of DNA while he was on a trip, and that's in his autobiography, apparently.
Didn't Terence McKenna talk about mushrooms lifting intelligence, or that there could be a correlation there? And I'm not saying that there is or there isn't.
Yeah,
but
I mean,
obviously this goes back into the
ancient traditions. It's down to it's shamanic traditions, isn't it? I mean, that's where you get into that. But I think that all ties into some of the sort of later stuff. I mean, going back to the sort of Disclosure Project and Greer and that sort of thing. So I wanted to get back to that time sort of line, as it were.
Yeah.
And I then found out about that, and I thought, what can I do? How can I get more people to know about this? So I ended up buying an LCD projector, which were still quite. It cost me £500.
Yeah,
which was
a lot of money. Still is, really.
Yeah. You're getting a lot cheaper now. That was in 2003, because I realised that if I got one of those, I could just stick this Disclosure Project video on a laptop, and then I could take. It was easy. I didn't need a video recorder and a TV. I had a couple of bags and a screen. I already had a screen.
Yeah.
And so I took it round to a few places. I organised a couple of showings at a local hall. It cost me like 20 or 30 quid.
Right.
And then nobody turned up. Literally nobody.
Right.
So I thought, well, that's not very good if I'm spending 30 quid and nobody's turning up.
Yeah. Was that just because then Disclosure was so obscure?
Well, I wasn't able to advertise it, you see, in a way which would grab people's attention.
Right.
I did get one read out on Radio Derby in 2003, and that was helpful in terms of the lady that I met. She was the only person that turned up.
Right.
And she said, "Oh, are you part of Omar's group?" And I said, "No, who's Omar?" And she told me about Omar Fowler, who's a very well-known UFO researcher, and I ended up getting in touch with him.
Right.
And in fact, I went to his group again last week. So I've known Omar for about 12 years now.
Does he publicise books, or is he?
Well, he's had a journal going, a UFO journal, for years and years. It's called OVNI, and he publishes this, I think, 6 times a year or 5 times a year or something.
What does that stand for? You have to forgive me.
OVNI is French. It's Objet Volant Non Identifié. So it's French for unidentified flying.
Right. Actually, this is synchronistic, because we were talking today about Duchovny from the X-Files. If you can break down his name, Duchovny.
Yeah, David Duchovny, David being blessed, Duchovny, Duke being royalty, so it's essentially his UFO royalty.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Wow. I wonder if that's his real name.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. So I got involved with Omar's group eventually, just on a small scale, and I went on Radio Derby with him a few weeks after that, I think, and I've still got the recording of that from 2003. That was quite good, because we talked about. I basically wrote to Radio Derby and says, "Can we talk about Disclosure Project?" And they invited me in for half an hour to talk about it.
So was you one of the first UK participants of the Disclosure Project? Was there any other disclosure?
There was one other guy called Ananda Sirasena was his name, but he was involved with the Ithera Society.
Okay,
which is
with an agenda then.
The Ithera Society, I mean, I've met some of those people, and they're lovely people. I know.
Is this to do with George King? Or
correct, Dr. George King.
And you see, George King is an interesting name. George, Greek, it means man. It comes from the earth. Basically, it's equivalent to Adam, because Adam and Adam are the earth, and King. So this is the Adamic King. would be
Yeah, well, there you
represented
go.
as a red king, basically.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
But if you think about Adamski as well, Adam and Sky. So
Yeah,
you're seeing
said,
these
yeah.
words, and Betty Anderson. Anderson is the son of man. So Adam is man, which is, you know, so all these names have these connotations about the son of man.
Yes,
But yeah.
very, very, very interesting. So I got involved with this disclosure project. I ended up sending Stephen Greer money as well, because what I ended up doing was I wrote to a few local clubs,
Yeah.
Probus Club, Women's Guild. Basically, I went to the local library.
Yeah.
Anybody that had a regular speaker for their group,
Yeah.
whatever group it was, I wrote to them, got some addresses, and said, "Would you like a talk on?"
You were
UFOs.
trying to infiltrate some of these groups.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, that's right. And that worked better because I didn't have to hire the hall. I
Yeah.
knew I was going to have an audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and so I could just turn up. Maybe there'd be 10, 20 people there. And
Yeah.
I certainly the Probus group I did in Derby.
Yeah.
That was great. I mean, that was 2003 again. And I think there were about 80 people there.
Right. I mean, some people come forward afterwards and say, "Well, thank you. You've really just changed my whole perception about."
Not quite. I didn't really get that reaction.
Right.
But a couple were quite enthusiastic.
Okay.
And again, you know, the whole Disclosure Project video was like 2 hours long, which was way too long. So I had to edit it down.
Yeah.
So that was one of my first early video edits.
Right.
And I was showing this. But then what I would do is if they paid me like 40 quid to cover my petrol
Yeah.
or whatever, I'd send 20 quid to Greer because I thought, well, I figured it's his video. He's put all the money into making it. And over a period of a couple of years, I probably sent Greer a couple of hundred quid, you know, from all these events that I'd done.
In terms of the Greer video, was there any testimony for you which really stood out?
Yes, I'd say Robert Salas particularly, and John Callaghan.
Is Salas the individual who talks about the missiles?
Correct, the missiles being shut down. His testimony stood out. John Callaghan particularly, his testimony. He was the head of the FAA Accidents Investigation Division.
Are they a division that retrieve unidentified objects?
No, they look at accidents or near air collisions and that sort of thing.
Right.
And he basically talked about the Japan Airlines case in 1986, where they had a Japan Airlines, I think, flight into one of the American airports. I can't remember which one. And it encountered a UFO, and it followed them for about an hour. And they had a radar trace of it.
This was quite a famous case,
yeah,
wasn't
it's
it?
quite well known.
Because the captain, didn't he describe it as a spaceship?
I can't honestly remember the way, but in other words, this is one of these cases. The documentation for it exists. Yeah. John Callaghan actually had a videotape of the radar recording because they played it back on a radar scope, and they were able to see the UFO blip zipping around. You know, measure the speed.
Because this was also a monstrous craft as well. It was about a mile or something.
It might well have been. I think
so. It was a very big craft, and it shone lights onto the pilots as well.
I think you could be right. I can't.
I do know that they were very relieved after that UFO disappeared because they were very shaken by it.
Yeah, and I mean, John Callaghan described how, you know, they got involved within the investigation.
But I think what's quite interesting about that case with the pilot is that in his mind there was no ambiguity. It's not, oh well, is this a strange light or isn't? He just said it's a spaceship. There's no way that it could be anything else but a spaceship. Absolutely,
you know, and so that particular case, there's documentation for it. He had the video that he'd made of the radar scope and so forth, which he still had a copy of. And he said that they were told not to talk about it. You know, two guys had come into the room and stuff. You can watch this; it's still online.
Right. Okay.
You know, and he was interviewed as well by Greer after this press conference, and his interview said the same thing. You know, there's no way he was making that up.
No.
So the number of testimonies like that, which I clipped out and put them together. Graham Bethune as well. He was clearly. A very reliable witness, very honest.
Which background did he come from?
He was a pilot. He was flying from Keflavik, Iceland, back to the US, I think, in about 1950s sometime. And they saw a craft that had a corona discharge around it, and they sort of it manoeuvred around their aircraft and stuff, shot behind it, and then people were banging their heads because they were trying to follow it, and this sort of thing.
Right.
Clearly a reliable witness, and so all that stuff really kicked me into the field in 2003. because I'd got this broadband connection,
Yeah.
I was looking at a lot of other stuff.
Right.
So energy stuff, I was looking at. I started to look. Next thing really was one of the main things was 9/11.
Right. Okay.
I'm thinking, 9/11. That was terrorist, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'm thinking, state-sponsored terrorism. What's that? And I've talked about this in interviews. Well, that was what I found. And I remember watching this film by George Humphrey. It's called 9/11: The Great Illusion. I thought, Great Illusion? What do you mean, Great Illusion?
Yeah.
And that was really the film which showed the towers being destroyed.
Yeah.
And it pointed out, for example, that the towers had come down very quickly.
Yeah.
The rate of free fall.
Yeah.
And it said that there must have been bombs in the towers.
Right.
And I thought, yeah, there must have been.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah.
So that was 2004, probably, by the time I was watching that.
Yeah.
And so by about September 2004, I'd started writing to my MP saying, this is not right.
Right.
This is not right.
At this point, did you feel that there was a government... Okay, maybe you were aware that perhaps there was some kind of cover-up in terms of that the information wasn't being forward or forthcoming, but did you actually think that there could be something sinister behind the cover-up? Or
not. I wasn't really thinking of what was behind it. No, I was just thinking that the official story was wrong, and I didn't know why. I didn't know why they would make up a story. I wasn't really thinking about that.
So the impetus was more wrong. Just to investigate this properly.
Yeah, and say
further investigation.
I knew at that time, for example, the basis on which they'd invaded Afghanistan was just a complete lie.
Right.
And I was thinking, so how the hell can they do that?
Yeah. Of course, because the Middle East policy was basically justified on...
Yeah, from what happened on 9/11. And when I then thought there would be bombs in the building, I thought, you can't do this. Why have they even done this?
Yeah.
Why are they even in Iraq? And so all these questions were being raised in my mind, having really... I've always been a pacifist.
Yeah.
When I first started working for GEC, I was asked if I would work on defence contracts. There was a little box you could tick on the application form, and I didn't tick it.
No.
I didn't want to work on any defence contracts.
No,
so thank you very much.
That, yeah.
And that was very early on. When I was 21,
Right.
I knew by then I was no way would I work on defence contracts. I never did, never have, never would.
Yeah. And that's where the real money is.
Yeah.
So
that's right. Yeah,
if you'd have ticked that box now, you'd have probably been a very wealthy man.
Well, I don't know if I'd be wealthy, but certainly there are more lucrative contracts to be had if you're in the right industry. Yeah. Certainly some of the people I worked with moved from GEC and went to work. Certainly one guy I knew, he went to work for Avonicom, which was a military... they were working with the military on electronic systems, avionics and stuff. So I was thinking 9/11 then became a focus because I was so flabbergasted that people couldn't see this, and there'd been this war.
Had you started to begin to tie together some of the pieces, let's say, with
no,
the
not much.
Not at that stage.
Not really. That
so
came
it was
later.
all very compartmentalised, this knowledge at this stage.
Yeah, pretty much. And obviously I was looking at other stuff like, Tales of Atlantis, the ancient civilizations and the ancient alien stuff. I'd heard the Von Daniken stuff. Yeah. Pretty much, around the time.
See, me, ancient aliens, again, AA is used in the Rosicrucian order, so it's a very significant logogram, AA. So Alcoholics Anonymous, Ancient Aliens. So again, it does tend to denote that here we're actually dealing with, let's say, an occult interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's all right, because it does that. The occult comes into it later on. And again, in reading all this stuff about 9/11, I think I'd probably come across something about the numerology and thought, oh yeah, that's interesting. I never knew that. I didn't really chuck it out, didn't put it in, kind of thing. It was there. I became aware of it. I became aware of what certain people were saying. Yeah. But I didn't say, oh yeah, that clearly explains everything about it. It wasn't like that. And so I got involved then. Would have been probably early 2005, mid 2005. I found that there were other people who were asking the same sorts of questions that I was about 9/11.
Was this primarily in the States or also
no, in the UK and the world? Primarily in the States, but I found a couple of people in the UK. Yeah. And that was then brought me on to getting involved with this forum, the UK 9/11 Truth Forum.
Right, okay.
And I then came into contact around the same time, again to 2005, that sort of time frame. I came into contact with David Shaler, Annie Mashon, who's both former MI5 people.
Right.
And the next logical stage then, because
so are you implying that they were somehow plants within, let's say, the alternative?
Certainly, Annie Mashon, I'm saying, certainly was. David Shaler, I think, was an honest guy. I think he was the real whistleblower, and I would say, which I'll clarify a little bit, but I would say that Annie Mashon still worked for MI5, and she was just assigned to Shaler to keep tabs on him. And
is there a clear agenda to try and subvert the truth movement, would you say?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. No question. I mean, that's what part of what that is in my book. You know.
I mean, was the truth movement even set up for that?
Yeah, well, you can argue that. This is certainly something that Dr. Judy Wood has said. We'll come on to Dr. Judy Wood later and how he became interactive with her, because that's actually partly connected to the ET thing, which I think I put in one of the questions.
And is she open-minded about the ET connection, or doesn't she talk about it?
She doesn't really talk about it that much. We've talked about it a little bit, but she doesn't. I think she wisely kind of
remains neutral.
Remains sort of neutral on it.
Yeah.
And I think that's good that she does that, really. But we'll go into that later, because we're sort of skipping ahead with the timeline really a little bit. So 2005, and in fact, we should also mention, because I've been here, that it was around about that. No, I think it was probably 2006 that you and I first spoke, wasn't it, Anthony?
Around that time.
It was this sort of time that Anthony and I got in touch.
I'm just saying, actually, I actually mentioned it was actually Annie Mashon who put me in touch with you, actually, if you remember back then.
Ah, yeah, it would have been, wouldn't it?
From Skipton area. Originally.
Ah, okay, yeah. So she was, so you were in touch with her before I was then, because of course you set that interview with Gary McKinnon, didn't you?
Oh yeah, because you and David Shaler met.
We went, because you gave me Gary's number.
That's right.
So this was that was in 2006 that we eventually spoke, but I didn't realise that Annie had given you my contact details, so that's interesting. So anyway, 2005, 9/11 Truth Movement. I was thinking, yay, people are getting together. We're going to change the world. Yeah. Whoopie-doo,
It hasn't happened yet.
Hasn't happened yet.
Maybe we're getting there. I don't know.
At least not in any obvious way. I think we can make an argument that there's more subtle things going on and whatnot. Right. But anyway, so David Shaler and Annie Mashon came to Derby. Yeah. I invited them to speak at the Metro Cinema, which has now since been taken over and converted to something else. And we showed the Loose Change film. The first Loose Change, number 1, it was actually the second one had already come out, but I didn't have a copy. Yeah. So we showed that. That was about an hour long, or 65
And what was
minutes.
the summary of the Loose Change film?
Well, basically the Loose Change film took apart the hijackers' fable in 9/11. Right. Looked a bit at the plane crashes, looked at the bombs in the building stories, and basically said, no, the official story is not true. Yeah. Bombs were planted in the buildings, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
So essentially the official story is a fabrication.
Total fabrication. Yeah. And David Shaler then did a talk, took Q&A after the film. Yeah. We filled the cinema. We got 120 people, right. And I was highly chuffed because and I knew that we got an article in the local paper. Right. I've still got a copy of that in my scrapbook folder thing at home. Yeah. Didn't bring that. That was a good event.
So that was one of the early successes.
That was an early success.
So that really showed the potential that if you had the right place to actually discuss this and the right promotion, that people were actually interested in this.
And of course David Shaler was very famous. He'd been on Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman in '98. Yeah. So a lot of people knew him.
And at this time, in terms of the news, I guess it was just very critical of the alternative interpretation, the alternative media.
Well, there wasn't much coverage really. Yeah. You'd get the occasional article. I think there's been a few more since, but there wasn't a lot of coverage. Yeah. But again, through 2005, 2006, we carry on doing it. We carried on organising events and things and writing letters. Yeah. I think the next time David Shaler came again, we tried to do 2 events. We did one in Nottingham. Just trying to think. So he came up again. I'm maybe getting the times mixed up. But yeah, he came up again, and we did 2 events in Nottingham. We did one at a banqueting hall where nobody turned up for that.
Right. Absolutely nobody.
Absolutely nobody. Well, in fact, one guy turned up. Right. Called Max Burns, and we know about Max Burns, of course. He turned up because he lived in Nottingham at the time. I think he's moved from Nottingham now.
Yeah.
And then we did another one. Where was the other event? Gosh, my memory's going. We did 2 events on the same day.
Max Burns, I don't know about
no,
Max Burns.
well, he's an investigator that investigated the 1997 Sheffield Flying Triangle incident.
Okay.
Where we had this flying triangle and an apparent crash in the Peak District when this plane, a tornado plane, was chasing a flying triangle. Max Burns actually came to that 2006 event.
Right.
So where did we do the other one? We did one.
So was he aware of all this material at this time, or was it quite eye-opening?
Oh no, Max Burns, I don't think was aware of it, but David Shaler was getting more and more aware of stuff.
Right.
David Shaler was, I mean, he is one of the few people that would actually look at. This is one of the issues, really. You know, a lot of people just stay focused on one topic. People that know me and have seen me on Richard Hall's program, we've talked about lots of different topics. You know, solar system stuff, UFO stuff, 9/11 stuff, free energy, chemtrails, all that stuff. Yeah. David Shaler was a little bit more like that. He would be prepared to talk about these other topics.
And you think it's really important to have a diverse knowledge in different topics?
I do.
In order to tie a lot of these,
Correct.
appear to be separate different areas but are actually interrelated.
Correct. And I'll try and bring that up to date quite soon. But anyway, I can't remember. I'm sort of racked my brains. We did 2 events in Nottingham. I can't remember where the second one was. It doesn't really matter. But in other words, so I got to know David a little bit. He'd spent some time at my house. I got to know Annie a little bit. Yeah. I regarded them as, you know, not sort of strong friends, but they knew me. They knew what I was like. You know, I entertained them. I gave them food, etc. When they came to stay, I took them to the station to get them back to wherever they were going. Right. You know, and I was quite open and straightforward with them and friendly. You know, etc., etc. And I go to the trouble of mentioning that because that will come into the story again later. Right. 2006, I ended up going to see Michael Meacher. We went to see him at his Oldham office. Where I went with Annie Mashon and Justin Walker, who's another activist in the 9/11 Truth movement. Yeah. And are
all these individuals still very much key players?
Well, Justin certainly is still doing a lot of stuff with the common law movement, Justin Walker.
Right.
Not sure what Annie Mashon is doing now. I think she's gone to live in Europe or something.
Right.
So anyway, so that was 2006, met Michael Meacher, talked to him for about an hour about 9/11 and stuff. Very peculiar meeting, because Meacher had spoken out in the press about 9/11 being a fake story, you know, the story was fake. He'd actually written this article in the, I always get it wrong, the Guardian or the Independent.
Yeah, he must have got into a lot of trouble for...
I don't know, he wrote this article called "This War on Terror is Bogus," and he argued that it was all to do with peak oil. And still, you can still find it if you look around.
But do you think, again, that is to divert away attention? Because it's almost like that they accept, okay, they'll say 10% of people are never going to buy the story, 90% will. So we've got to deal with this 10%. So we put out this story in order to divert the attention away.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, so we had this, I talked about how we were meeting Annie Mashon, I talked about meeting her and David Shaler, and then somebody, I think it was just in with the meeting with Michael Meacher, the former Education Cabinet Minister, MP for Oldham, and we didn't go and see him in London, we decided to go and see him in Oldham, we made an appointment. Right. That was in October 2006. Okay. And this was a sort of key time frame for me. And we went to see him, we spent an hour with him. Right. We talked about 9/11 because he'd expressed scepticism, as I said, about the official story. And I think, as Anthony had said, he had later, I think it was after we met him, he had talked about showing the Loose Change film in Parliament to a group of MPs. Right. Now that, as it turned out, never happened. Right. I think for various reasons. But you know, we were quite keen for something like that to happen, and so we that's partly why we went to see him.
I mean, is that on the cards? That's still on the card. I know this happened 10 years ago.
No, I don't think anything like that. I mean, 9/11 is sort of fading into history now, much as the Kennedy assassination is. Yeah. But
they're almost presenting it almost as the unknowable, isn't it?
To some extent, well, it's a done deal for the mainstream, you know, as much as with everything else. So we went to meet Meacher. We had an hour-long meeting. Yeah. He kept looking around the room. Right. And he explained to us that when he brought up the subject of 9/11 and tried to talk about it with other MPs, he got the weirdest reaction, you know, like he was an alien or something, you know. And
Right.
that wasn't his word.
When you say looking around the room, that he looked a bit worried or anxious?
He looked
about?
slightly paranoid, as if he was maybe thinking there might be hidden microphones, you know, monitoring his conversation.
Yeah.
That was the feeling I got.
Right.
But I think it was partly just his general disposition. He had this sort of slightly frightened air about him all the time, I think. But if you listen to some of his interviews.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I gave him this 200-page report, which I'd sort of printed out, which was like a summary of all the activities we'd been doing up to the end of 2006.
Yeah.
You know, we'd been to the Stop the War March.
Yeah.
We'd sort of tacked onto their march and held up 9/11 banners.
Right.
I mean, you were on that march, weren't you? I got a picture of you on that.
Right.
And things like that. And we'd written various sort of things into BBC and newspapers and stuff, saying, look, you need to investigate this properly.
Yeah.
But of course, also during that time frame, I'd started to become sceptical again a little bit of the story which I'd been given as a replacement for the official story, which was the bombs in the building story. In other words,
and I think that's an interesting choice of words there, the replacement story.
Well, I mean, that's just mine. Yeah, that's just mine.
Yeah, but I think that's a very apt description.
Yeah, so they knew, I think, that people...
It's almost controlling the discourse, the dialogue in terms of...
Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly what was going on.
Yeah.
And I was becoming... I'd started, I think at that point, I had corresponded with either Dr. Morgan Reynolds, who'd written this paper about the plane crashes at the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
And he'd written that paper with Dr. Judy Wood, who we've mentioned very briefly, who's a key figure in
what was if you can summarise the key thesis of that report, what did it basically state?
Well, it looked at various anomalies with the plane crashes. For example, the holes in the buildings weren't the right size to have been caused by those plane crashes. That was one thing.
So, okay, that's a very interesting fact to begin with.
Yeah. And it looked at the impact speed.
Yeah.
And the fact that you couldn't really fly a plane that quickly at that altitude and that accurately.
Right.
There were questions like that raised. Also, if you looked at the physics of the crash, would aluminium wing struts cut through steel girders?
Yeah.
The basic answer is no, they wouldn't.
I think that's quite interesting if you watch the Trump interview as well. Have you watched that interview?
No, I've heard about this, but Trump is, he's just another...
Yeah, no, in his interview, this was, I think this was around the time of the towers, the explosions. He was saying he found it very surprising that the aeroplanes went through the towers, and he couldn't understand how that had occurred, because he said that they shouldn't be able to go through the towers. And he was saying that it must have been created through some kind of explosion. He didn't exactly stipulate what, but because previously he'd actually, with a structural engineer, he'd investigated the initial attacks on the towers, which were done in the basement, I think several years before.
Yeah, 1993.
Yeah, and he was saying that these buildings were extremely strong.
I have seen that, actually, yeah. So he did express some scepticism, it's true. So that's sort of interesting. But yeah, Trump is another. Yeah,
you think he's another placement in terms of
pretty much. I mean, we're jumping ahead in the time frame quite a bit, but so I'd seen this scepticism expressed about the plane crashes at the World Trade Center, which was new to me, relatively new, because everyone else was expressing scepticism about the crash at the Pentagon, but most of the other people I was talking to thought that real planes did crash into the World Trade Center.
So this was new material, essentially.
To me, that was sort of new in 2006. It wasn't new to some people. They'd been talking about this since 2002, 2003.
Right.
And so, I was also then getting into touch with Dr. Judy Wood, because she'd co-authored this article with Morgan Reynolds about plane crashes. Because Dr. Judy Wood was a former professor of mechanical engineering. Right. So she knew about this. In other words, mechanics that should have been going on, the sorts of stresses that were involved on the materials. She actually wrote scientific papers. She taught classes about those sorts of topics. Right. And I'd ended up corresponding with her, and then, as we were saying in the break, the person that comes into the picture now is a chap called Frank Ferguson. Yeah. And he somehow had seen some talk that I'd given, or some article that I'd written, or he knew that I was involved in this Scholars for 9/11 Truth group,
Right.
which I haven't mentioned actually. I should have mentioned that.
Yeah.
Because I got involved with this Scholars 9/11 Truth group in parallel with this UK 9/11 Truth forum.
Right.
And I was invited to join that Scholars for 9/11 Truth group, which was just a website basically that listed its members. It wasn't really anything more than that.
And how did you find that then initially?
Well, that was very interesting because I thought, oh yeah, hip hip hooray, we've got some academics.
At last,
expressing scepticism openly.
And people are going to now begin to listen. And
they're going to listen to us. They're going to listen to these professors.
Yeah.
And we're going to get some papers out there and some press releases, which is what they started doing.
Yeah.
And people are going to say, oh yeah, that needs looking at. And I was invited to join that group by two people, Stephen E. Jones, who was a physics professor from Brigham Young University, who was a very important name in this story,
right?
Because he's central to the cover-up of some of these topics,
right?
And Jim Fetzer, who I thought were good guys. I thought they were straight academics from a regular university, reputable university, and that they would help find the truth about 9/11 in their own way.
Yeah.
I didn't think at all that they would actually want to cover up what happened. No, that was a real. That wouldn't even been on.
So
my
you think
radar
this
screen.
website was first of all to collect who is sceptical and who's sort of interested in the subject of 9/11 in terms of the academics.
Yes.
And then the second thing was to subvert that information in some way, or to control the conclusions which were arrived at.
And that's what I ended up 2-3 years on from 2007, publishing a book a free book, 9/11 Finding the Truth, which I think you read. So.
Which is a very good book. It's an excellent book on the subject, and I think it summarises the key points of 9/11 and why the official story is very weak. So
yeah. So anyway, so we had that this was all happening in the mix together. The meeting with Meacher, 9/11 Truth Movement UK, Scholars for 9/11 Truth. That was all. So I wasn't really involved much in the disclosure type stuff then. I'd kind of got sucked into the 9/11 stuff. I was still listening to Coast and things like this, and if Jim Mars or somebody was on, then I'd listen to that or whatever. But I was heavily involved in this.
Right.
And this Frank Ferguson. Now it turns out that he lived in Washington DC. He'd somehow got me in touch and said, "Oh, you should speak to Dr. Judy Wood."
Right.
Don't know why he thought that, but that turned out to be a very important connection.
Yeah.
And I later learned that Frank Ferguson. His father worked in black programs. His father worked
in black ops.
Well, in black programs, not so much black ops. Black ops is more, you think of that as some.
You see, when I think, and I'm looking at this from an occult perspective, but going into the priesthood, you've got the Sodi priesthood, which is the priesthood of Moses, and is related to the etymology of Sauda, which is black, and Shed, which is a type of jinn. So. The black priesthood, which feeds into the black nobility, is all about the Judaic or Mosaic priesthood. But whether that's connected with, let's say, black ops, but I just think that is interesting. That connection.
Yeah, I don't know how that would connect. It may well connect at some deeper level to all of this.
Yeah.
And I think there is definitely an occult angle in all of this, which we talked about briefly earlier on. But that's not been my focus of investigation again.
No, I think you're more nuts and bolts, more science,
technology and that type of thing. Yeah, but I do realise the importance of those other factors, such as you've mentioned there. So Frank Ferguson, he said that his father was working on space platforms in the 50s, in the 1950s.
Right. Okay.
He said that his father had 40 PhD qualified people working for him on these projects.
Space platforms,
that's what he told me.
Are we talking about platforms of technology or platforms as in platforms in space, like
platforms
satellites?
in space, apparently quite some distance from the Earth. Not,
right.
In other words, somewhere out in the solar system, not just orbiting platforms.
Which kind of rewrites everything in terms of...
Well, basically. Yeah. So Frank was quite familiar with talk of anti-gravity technology and so forth. And we ended up going to stay with him in 2008. I continued to talk with Frank fairly regularly. Yeah, he would ring me up and tell me various things. Yeah, and we would talk with him, and Judy would talk with him. Right, and he helped us quite a lot. Right, in being very supportive. Yeah, he got me onto this Ambrose Lane program. Ambrose Lane was a civil rights activist in the Washington DC area. And he was very well known, actually, more well known than I realised. Right. He sadly passed on, I think, in 2011 or 2010, around that time
Right.
frame. But he was very supportive of what we were trying to do, and what Dr. Wood was putting out, the information she was putting out.
Yeah.
The key thing being that by sort of early 2007, I knew that what was being put out by most of the truth movement was wrong. In other words, the destruction of the World Trade Center wasn't caused by bombs or gravity collapse or anything like that. It was caused by an energy weapon. And there's that word again, energy.
Energy weapon.
It was an energy weapon.
And you think that rather than that, let's say that this was more misperceptions from academics, that there was a deliberate cover-up in terms of directing,
of course,
because as it
turned out, this Stephen E. Jones character, it became clear to me in mid 2007 that he was involved with 9/11 research because he had to cover up the energy aspects. Because why I say that is, as I've said on many interviews, he was involved with cold fusion research in the 1980s.
And does he ever express this fact or this?
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, Stephen E. Jones has said, I've got all recordings of him, talking about coining the term cold fusion. He coined the term, with Paul Palmer, his colleague. I've got an interview of him saying this.
Right.
So he knew Pons and Fleischmann. He tried to say that they were wrong, but he tried to say it in a nice way, and he claims he didn't, and say they were wrong and all this nonsense. But Jones is covering up the use of free energy.
Right.
I think Jones was briefed on what caused the destruction of the towers, and he was then briefed with a cover story, which was this thermite substance which was used to help cover that up.
Right.
And then he was also briefed to try and discredit anybody, such as Dr. Wood primarily, and myself, who were putting out this information, and that's what he did. And we've got interviews of him saying that this Dr. Judy Wood is gone in with these terrible methods of trying to attack Jones, and she says that he says that she attacked him. That's not true. And I've written all of this up.
You mean verbally?
Well, yes, verbally, not physically. I've written all of this up in my book at length, and people can read that as much as they wish. It's free. Similarly, Fetzer was set up as a fake defender of Dr. Judy. He pretended to be defending her when actually he wasn't. He was just keeping tabs on her.
Right, okay.
And that later became clear because he later then... we were all in this scholars group, so Dr. Judy Wood was in this Scholars for Nine Truth, I was, Morgan Reynolds was, Fetzer was, Jones was, and there were about 60 or 70 other people as well on the sidelines. And many of them attacked Dr. Wood's research, said that what she said couldn't be true.
Right.
I think some of them did it because they knew that she was correct, and they were, they were given orders to attack her. And some of them just did it because everyone else was doing it.
Right, okay.
If you see what I mean.
I mean, were there researchers who were saying, actually, well, let's hold back here and let's re-look at some of this evidence?
One or two. I mean, there were one or two that were supportive, up to a point.
Yeah.
But I think they were kind of just got a bit chivied up by Jones and Fetzer and joined in the mudslinging, or at least maybe didn't pick up the mud balls and sling them back at those two guys, perhaps as much. And that's what I started doing. Right. I started saying, well, if they're slinging mud at this, I think this is right. So I'm going to pick up these mud slings that they're looking at.
And instantly,
me, my tape loading hacking thing, I would look at these mud balls and I would pull them apart. Yeah. And see what the mud was made of and why they were throwing this mud.
So what started out as essentially perhaps what could have been a very constructive movement became a shambles very quickly.
Yes, precisely. And the other thing I can bring in this time frame as well, which you've got next to you there, because this factors in my, or brings in my time with the Open University. I mentioned earlier on...
Show this, we'll wait. So, the camera.
I'll show it.
Okay, you do that.
So this is I'll show the cover as well. So this factors in because I started working for the Open University in 2002. So I've worked for them for 14 years, and I still work for them. Yeah. And because it's all distance learning. Yeah. And I'm a lone worker. I don't think anybody in the OU is aware of any of the research on this area I'm doing. They're not aware of my other life, so to speak.
Right. Okay.
Nobody is.
No.
And I don't think they would care to be, frankly.
No.
And obviously, in this video and all the others, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Open University.
No.
But though I say that, in 2007, an opportunity arose whereby I was able to write an article about 9/11. Yeah. and I got this published in the Social Services Faculty Magazine, Social Sciences, I should say, Faculty Magazine, which is called Society Matters, and it's called 9/11 and the War on Terror, Creating Official Reality. That was the title that I chose, and this mentions Dr. Judy Wood's research and bombs in the building, and it mentions the NIST technical reports, which we might mention a little bit about later on. And that I think that's almost my insurance policy for the Open University. So if they ever turn around to me and say, "What do you think you're doing?" with all this conspiracy stuff, which I don't think they will, frankly.
No.
Certainly not as things stand at the moment.
No.
I can say, well, this is what I'm doing with it. Actually, look on your website, because this is on their website. This article can be found on their website, Society Matters Issue 10. I've got a link on my website too.
But I also think in terms of sociological studies, and I'm thinking particularly in terms of media studies throughout universities, is that there is a deconstruction of the media and the perception of the media. So that's not necessarily out of turn with what's going on within the social sciences. Maybe not.
And I later actually learned something quite interesting, because I after that was published in August 2007. I wrote it, I think, in about January or February, and then they put it in the August edition. It's only published once a year, that. And about a week after that was published, I saw an article by Robert Fisk, who wrote for The Independent, and he'd copied some of my article.
Right, excellent.
He hadn't credited me, but I'd used certain facts and figures in there, and he'd used them in his article, and he mentioned two professors, but he didn't name them.
Right.
And he mentioned that there were two professors that had started court action over 9/11, but he didn't name them.
And why would he miss out that crucial
piece of
information?
You tell me. And that's exactly what Annie Machon essentially did, going back to her, because I was still sort of communicating with her from time to time, and I said to Annie Machon, this was actually in 2008, so the following year, about 6 or 7 months, because she was going around, Annie Machon, prominent, the partner of David Shaley. She talked about the Shaler affair. She wrote a book called Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers, which was, I think it probably got quite a large circulation. Her name was known, so she would be very much more likely to get asked to do talks on 9/11 type stuff, conspiracy type stuff at the various conferences.
Because she was a published author, essentially.
Yep, correct, exactly, than I was. So I wrote to her one time in 2008, and I said, Annie, when you go and talk to these events, would you mind mentioning Dr. Judy Wood's court case, just in passing? Because we think it's important that people know about this court case, because it's very important. And just to give you the background for that, because I've skipped ahead in the story, in 2007, Dr. Judy Wood realised that the towers, she'd realised that the towers turned to dust much earlier. So the key thing is, as she says, the towers didn't burn up. They didn't slam to the ground. They turned to dust in midair. And thank you, Anthony, for getting me that. And this is ultimately the result of that research. Where did the towers go? Which I've talked about ad nauseam. But before this book was the court case. So in other words, the information that's in this book was in a court case. And the court case was to challenge...
Was this book written primarily to present the information within court? So
not really. I mean, that book was written because the court case didn't go anywhere. So the information that's disclosed in that book was essentially what we would like to have disclosed in the court case.
Was there a key piece of evidence for Dr. Judy Wood in terms of if she just suddenly said, "Wow, it can't be dynamite, it can't be thermite"?
Yes, it was. I mean, is
it the justification of the towers?
She said the towers didn't burn up. They didn't slam to the ground. They turned to dust in midair, or mostly to dust, about 90% of the buildings. And that's proved beyond any doubt. Going back to this, moving from doubt to knowledge to certainty. That is what that book will give you. That once you've read that book, if you read it with a properly focused mind, you will know that that's what happened to the buildings. Therefore, it proves that a technology exists. Just leave it at that for now, which can do it. And I asked Annie Machon to talk about this court case because originally Dr. Wood challenged the NIST technical report writers, which were some contractors. She challenged them for scientific fraud. So you can do that in law if
Right.
you set it up correctly. That case was set up by the attorney Jerry
Right.
Leaphart.
Yeah.
All this documentation is on Dr. Judy Wood's website.
Right.
That court case lasted about 2.5 years. We were essentially given no support by the 9/11 Truth Movement. They actually tried to belittle the case. Annie Machon refused to talk about it, claiming that this was speculation, when you can clearly see...
But even if it was speculation, and even, dare we say, if it was wrong, it was still a good thing because it was getting into the public consciousness, that essentially the story, there was something fundamentally wrong with the story. So you would still expect, even if she didn't naturally, fall within that position, to support the case. That would make sense.
Exactly. But she refused. She point blank refused to talk about it because she classified it as speculation, which, of course, for somebody who works for MI5, who has some kind of analytical skill with information or intelligence work, it's ridiculous. So Annie Machon is an intelligent woman, So I later saw her at an event, I think it was in 2010 or 11, and I sort of said hello to her and she just got up and walked off. She wouldn't talk to me.
No.
So I realised, and then also actually there was another episode, I think in 2008 or 2009, and Anthony might remember this, where she attempted to smear me an email. I won't go into the details, but she attempted to say that I was unreliable and I'd been spreading rumours about her, which was totally untrue.
Right.
And so I won't. There's just too, that's just
cutting.
Kind of, I wouldn't go into that here.
No.
But if people want to write to me, I can tell them a bit more about that if they're really interested.
But the relationship essentially broke down then.
Well, I just want to mention one of the things about that was it's so unfair because, unfortunately for Annie, I was witness to a lot of things she was claiming, so I was able to stand up and say, look, what she's saying is inaccurate.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, Anthony was part of witness to what actually happened.
Right.
So he knew that what she was trying to say wasn't accurate.
Yeah, essentially it was propaganda.
Yeah, well, I mean, she was basically trying to say that I was an unreliable observer.
Right.
And that was as a result. She did that as a result of a private conversation that I had with somebody else on the telephone, who I know that person is.
Yeah.
I hadn't posted anything on the internet. I hadn't sent anything round an email.
Right.
It was her that brought up this issue.
Yeah.
That she said that I'd been spreading rumours about her. That was untrue. I had a private conversation with somebody about my concerns about what Annie Machon had done. Having a private conversation with somebody on the telephone is not spreading rumours.
No, when you're allowed to have doubts anyway. I mean, you're researching this. It's a fundamental piece of key evidence which you didn't agree with. So that's a fair point.
I realised at that point that if she's prepared to make stuff up about me, then that means she's not interested in the truth. Yeah. And if she's not going to support a court case, which is been done by a highly qualified scientist, Dr. Judy Wood, that was that.
Do you think there was an attempt then to smear you? Because in a sense you've almost become the... in Britain, anyway, the public face of Dr. Judy Wood's research in the UK. I mean, are there other proponents? Because I haven't really seen anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially how it's turned out. That wasn't obviously my plan.
No.
But that's essentially how it's turned out. Yeah. Richard D. Hall, of course, has been of great assistance in sort of promulgating the information that's in the Where Did the Towers Go book and in my book. And we know that it's true for two reasons. One is because of the physical evidence that's in the book, which I already covered.
The lack of physical evidence.
Well, yeah, you could say that. The lack of buildings, certainly. Yeah. But the other is, if you look at the energy effects, which I won't discuss here, because there are plenty of other interviews where I've gone through this in great detail, as has Dr. Wood. But we knew that the energy weapon was used. It was an energy weapon. Yeah. We knew that it's related to the Hutchison effect, which is this name given to the effects seen by the Canadian researcher John Hutchison, who's done experiments with electromagnetism, with electromagnetic waves, such as microwaves, radar equipment, electrostatic fields. What's he done? He's created levitation. He's created changes in materials where metal has turned to jelly and metal has fused with wood. Right. He's created effects that have lasted after the experiment has finished, and he switched off all the equipment.
So the degrading of metal, for example.
Exactly, the degrading of metal. He's seen sort of fuming effects. Yeah. What was seen at the World Trade Center after the event, fuming, changes in materials. What was seen during the event, levitation. Yeah. What was seen, the filing cabinet, for example, where paper is fused into metal. Right. All those effects
Yeah.
are seen in the World Trade Center are the same as John Hutchison. So in other words, what Dr. Wood has shown in that book, and she was talking about since 2007, November, was when we first posted the webpage. So we're now 9 years on from that.
Yeah.
We're 9 years on from the connection between
With the
the
Hutchinson effect. I mean, is this just? Do you think that it's using the Hutchinson effect, or is it a different technology which has a lot of the properties of the Hutchinson effect?
We don't know. We don't know exactly. We can't say that because we don't know who owns the technology. We don't know where it is. We don't know where it was developed. Although we have a clue, I think, a strong clue. We'll just mention that because it is. Again, I've talked a lot about this in other interviews.
I mean, maybe this is speculative, but how was it directed at the building? Was it directed as a wave? Like a gun?
It's an interference effect. So it appears that there were different sources of energy, one being electrostatic, one being the Earth's magnetic field. So that is directed, isn't it? And we know that the Earth's magnetic field is directed because you can have a compass.
Does this connect into, let's say, HARP and this type of
we don't know.
technology?
I don't think it's HARP. I'd say it's not got anything to do with HARP. That doesn't really fit with.
And what
the
about the
picture very
material? Because in the book also she talks about tornadoes, and these effects are found within tornadoes. And there was a tornado at the time.
Oh, there was a hurricane rather than a tornado. Yeah.
Right, sorry.
So the hurricane, it would appear, if anything, provided the electrostatic field.
Right.
So that was the electrostatic component, the static field.
So you're saying this tornado was artificially created?
It was a hurricane, but it was hurricane.
Hurricane, sorry.
It looks to me, whether it was artificially created, I don't know, but it certainly looks like it was steered. Because
So
if you
hijacked
or possibly hijacked, if that's the word you want to use.
Yeah.
If you look at the path, you can see that the path is coincident. We might even try and insert this in the video, possibly.
Yeah.
But the path is coincident with the events of 9/11.
Yeah.
And so
I
forth.
think there was a lack of reporting about the
Somewhat, yes.
tornado.
It didn't go completely unreported, but they seemed to
Kept
play
very
it down
low-key. Yeah.
compared to how they've done it more recently.
You've seen as this massive storm was just basically breaking off the coast of New York. It's a bit of an anomaly, really, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And there's Hurricane Bill and Hurricane Sandy since that, which have been far more, easily reported, far more widely reported than Hurricane Erin was. But again, I've talked about that in a lot of other interviews, and you can check those out. So just put in Hurricane Erin, 9/11, energy effects.
But you see, with the name Erin as well, Erin is the old word for the Watchers. The Watchers, if you translate the Hebrew word Erin, it means a watcher, but you translate that into Greek, is a dragon. Drakon is to watch from Drakos, which is the old word for an eye. So again, it's a symbol of the dragon. Just again, this is kind of cool. It might be coincidental, but it's...
You never know. I mean, they do choose these names for hurricanes based on the letter of the alphabet, don't they? But I don't know if that's connected. Could be. But so that was all established by 2008. The Hurricane Erin data came in. Dr. Wood had posted that early in 2008.
Had she... prior to this, had she suspected that there was a connection?
No, she didn't know anything about it until early 2008. I think it was February when she found the hurricane data. And
how did she come about with the information with Hutchinson effect? Because was that suddenly, right, I've got it now, that's the missing piece that I've been looking for?
Yeah, kind of. I think either somebody sent her a blog link, because I think she'd been posting stuff about energy effects, and I think either she's found the link herself to a blog about energy effects, which happened to be one of John Hutchison's blogs, and she saw all the same effects that she'd seen in the World Trade Center evidence. And the thing is, again, why we think Fetzer, this Jim Fetzer character, which she described to me that she told Fetzer, we were talking every day at those times. She'd shown this to Fetzer, and immediately she didn't tell him what it was. She said, I've got a new web page that I've made, and it was about the Hutchinson effect and 9/11.
Right.
And he said, I've just got to go down into my basement and get a cup of coffee so I can sit and talk with you about it.
Yeah.
Went down, sat down, he switched on the computer. She sent him the link. He clicked on it, and the page came up, 9/11 and the Hutchinson effect. And what does Fetzer do? First thing he has to do is go and make a phone call. So, what does that tell you?
Yeah.
Read into that what you will, but it became clear from that point that soon after that, I think within in the new year 2008, January, Ace Baker character, launched a smear campaign against John Hutchison, and then kind of against me as well, to a lesser extent. and that's all in my book.
Right.
So in other words, this all was giving us confirmation that yes, the World Trade Center was destroyed with an energy weapon.
Yeah.
It was related to the Hudson effect.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the things that then tie into this, and this sort of, I think, moves it a bit more towards your area perhaps, you get into the area of what is the underlying fabric of reality. What is the ether? Can the ether, is what my word for the underlying fabric of reality, it's not the only word, there are plenty of others, can that be engineered? What happens when you tweak it? What happens when you change, for example, the properties that make molecules or atoms of a metal stick together? What if you can somehow zap the underlying fabric of reality around that piece of metal and it decides to become dust rather than be a metal bar or a girder or whatever? And that's what I think the Hudson effect is about. It's about re-engineering the underlying fabric of reality.
Right.
And that also, I think, ties in another level to consciousness. Because, as you know, consciousness, we talked about this a bit earlier, interfaces somehow with the fabric of reality in a different way. So I think, and somebody else that wrote to me, Peter Taylor Wood, he came out with this interesting point, and it was not too long ago, and he said that what happened at the World Trade Center involved the forces from which life itself arises.
Right, and what was his qualifications?
Well, he was thinking of it from a consciousness point of view,
right, okay.
And in terms of how does life arise, or how does a conscious being, become a conscious being.
So we're talking about here the nature of consciousness, the ontological question.
Right. And some of that is also to do, of course, with energy. I mean, conscious energy and things like that. So you've got the energy factoring into that. So this, I think...
Well, consciousness, I think, is linked into light and into photons.
Yeah, well, what's photons? Photon is a form of energy.
Exactly. And I mean, if you look at the word soul as well, soul, which is the sun, but this is very different from the spirit, because the spiritus is the breath or the vibration,
yes,
which the Greeks referred to as the logos. And that actually fits into Pythagoras. Have you come across Pythagoras'
a little bit.
monocard?
A little bit.
Well, Pythagoras was talking about that there's a monocard, so the lowest notes, which are the slowest resonating notes, is physical reality, but the highest notes, which resonate the quickest, is the spirit world. And he drew this comparison, let's say, between the 7 planets. Each of the planets themselves in their orbits have a different resonating note, which very much ties into the fundamental nature of reality. But again, I think when you kind of look at Pythagoras' monocard, it has many implications, for example, for string theory, because, this idea that underlying reality, there is this vibration, which the Greeks, which I said earlier, referred to as the logos. So, and again, Plato was talking about the implicated order when he was talking about the universal forms. The idea that forms themselves, the potentiality of the form exists before it's actually manifested. And that in itself ties in with waveform duality and waveform reality.
I can see that a little bit. Yeah. So I think, you start moving into those areas, and that's why this research is so important, because I think you can begin to see more clearly that there is a link between the technological side and not so much the spiritual side perhaps, but the consciousness side in the form of energy being moved between different realms.
And that's an interesting point. Did you, at this point, were you making a connection perhaps with potential ET technology? I'll use that word, however problematic that word may be.
Well, yes, because I think when Dr. Judy was looking at all this evidence about these weird effects back in 2007, she said, well, what's caused this?
Right.
I don't know of anything on Earth that's caused this. She didn't say that, she did say this explicitly at one point.
Anything on Earth. That's a curious term.
Yeah, so that was, I wasn't specifically thinking in those terms, but then when I saw, for example, the Hudson effect, and I knew who was connected to that, the other person that we can bring into the picture is Colonel John Alexander, because he went to visit John Hutchison in 1983, and again I've spoken about this at length on interviews, so I won't dwell on it too much here. because I want to get on to more the disclosure side,
Sure.
which is, you know, what we were going to talk about.
I mean, is the Hutchinson effect linked into what was known as the Philadelphia experiment, in which...
You could say that again. It's something that did the Philadelphia experiment happen?
Is it propaganda?
Was it some cover story for something else? Was
Yeah.
it an exaggerated story? Not sure. I think something happened. I think certain people were involved. Is Hutchinson effect technology related to that? Possibly. There are some similar themes with people being fused into the deck of the ship, where you've got this fusing of materials. Was that the same thing? You know, the reality around the metal is breaking down. The person stood there in the same bit of reality, and they get merged together when the energy is switched off. Don't know. Maybe. You know, that's all I can say with any certainty. But going back to Colonel John Alexander, he worked for Los Alamos National Laboratories, which is where, of course, they developed the atomic bomb. But he's also a sort of gentle UFO debunker. Right. John Alexander talks about UFOs, and he's involved to some extent on the sidelines of the disclosure scene. I believe Anthony, has he written a book about UFOs, John Alexander?
It's called, isn't it?
It's mildly deep, what's it called? Yeah, so John Alexander, Myths, Conspiracies and Realities is the name of John. And this came out not too long ago. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, wasn't it? I haven't got my glasses on. So, you know, this brings us right into the UFO type disclosure. Yeah. Oh, forward by Jacques Vallée. I didn't know that. Right. Blimey, I knew he'd written this book, but again, I'm not being much of a book reader. I haven't read it.
So this is cynical of the UFO.
So it's somewhat. I mean, I wouldn't say it's totally cynical, but this book I would say is doing what's called muddle up.
Muddle up or muddle up.
Muddle up or muddle up. Yes. Either or both.
Not to be confused with mudslinging. But very closely related.
Where you get the good information, you mix it with the not so good information, and try to stop people from distinguishing between the two.
Sandwich the truth with the lie.
Yeah, I mean, all that kind of stuff. The way that works, I think, is more complicated and more subtle than people realise. In other words,
it's a big part of the alternative community.
Yes, it is, and it's very simple to create doubt. Yeah, it's very simple to create doubt. You know, you just need somebody to speak up in a room full of people and say, "Oh, that's so and so." You know, that's been debunked. Yeah. You know, and then people will believe that it's been debunked. They won't bother to go and check it or check if that person is just making it up.
So essentially, he's saying that UFOs are.
He doesn't know probably what they are. Okay. That's probably what he will say. Right. Or he will say it's a mixture of this and a mixture of that. But I think he knows a lot more than he lets on. He certainly knows about...
Share my thoughts on this, because I mean, I remember seeing John Alexander give a talk at the X conference. I think it might be the first or the second one. Yeah. And what was interesting was he always talk that a speaker refused to have it filmed, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. But it seemed from the outset he was basically saying how all the other ufologists are wrong. But what I look at now, I mean, is...
That's a big thing to say, though, isn't it? That all ufologists are wrong.
Yeah, it strikes me. I mean, it's part of something organisation called the Aviary, if you remember.
The Aviary.
The Aviary, yeah. I forget what it's
called. The bird.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Robert Graham's been writing a bit about this actually recently, but I don't know too much about it. But as far as it's concerned, to me, it's kind of a limited hangout kind of position in a certain sense. If you look at it as a legitimate work of research, it's very limited in the way it goes, and maybe it tallies with something like the buoyant plasmas that the Ministry of Defence is pretty condign, as talks about. Because he's a military, what else can he write about? Maybe if there is such a thing as a conspiracy. If there isn't, maybe that's all there is. But we wouldn't really learn that from limited research, really.
That's exactly my impression of him, that he's there to insert doubt.
Right, okay.
And that just by saying at that talk, for example, or maybe in his book, I know all these things, which means that all these other UFO researchers are wrong. Yeah. That right there inserts doubt. Yes. You know,
and it's an absolute statement as well.
Yeah, pretty much. And he doesn't come along and say, well, actually, if you look at the Robert Salas's case, it's clear that some object was above the base and the missiles were shut down. If you look at all the documentation, all the witness accounts, that's what happened. We don't know what caused the shutdown. We don't know where the object came from. Yeah. We don't know why it shut down. Yeah. But we do know that it was shut down. A technology was involved. Yeah. And that's the end of it. That's the bit about being certain about that. I'm pretty certain that that's what happened based on everything I've seen about that case. Yeah. And like Travis Walton, I'm certain that Travis Walton was knocked out by some energy force. Yeah. He was taken off the ground. He went into a flying saucer. Yeah. He went somewhere, I know not where, and then he came back again 5 days later. Yeah. All the evidence that I've seen tells me that that's what happened. Yeah. I'm certain about that. Right. and he met some aliens,
Yeah.
and they, did certain things to him. End of. That's the story.
Yeah.
And this is what disclosure is about. And it's people like John Alexander that are hampering that process
knowledge.
of people coming to the conclusion that yes, these things really did happen. And there are many people. Animation is another one.
Yeah.
Animation is part of the process that has helped to prevent people from understanding that what is in the Where the Towers Go book is the truth.
Yeah.
And it really is a real technology,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
And then we go back from this, because we're talking about 9/11, we're talking about technology, we're talking about energy, we've covered those things, I think. So Hudson was visited by Alexander. Alexander clearly knew about the technology, according to what John told us. So that means that he knew somebody that knew what this technology was back in 1983.
Right.
So when we get to 2001, the technology is already 20 years old.
When was Hutchinson closed down in his work? Because didn't the military...
In 1990s, he had some of his equipment stolen then, but I think he got most of it back.
Right.
But he was in his apartment in New Westminster, which is Vancouver, till about 2008, I think.
Right.
He moved out of there eventually. Now he lives in the US. But Alexander is clearly, to me, he's connected to Los Alamos. What did they do there? They developed the A-bomb.
Yeah.
Also factoring into this, which I haven't mentioned, and this fits in with the next part of the equation, as it were, or the picture, Science Applications International Corporation. I mentioned earlier on that Dr. Wood started this court case. One of the defendants in the court action was a company called Science Applications International Corporation,
Right. Okay.
because they were involved in producing the NIST technical reports, which were the official technical reports, not the 9/11 Commission report,
Right.
about the destruction of the World Trade Center. They helped to put the report together. They contributed some expertise to that. And
their conclusions, is that the famous pancake effect of the
well,
buildings?
that was the conclusion of the official story, essentially, the official NIST accounts, essentially.
Yeah.
Although they sort of backtracked and said that they explained events up to the point of collapse, but not the collapse itself. That was what they said in a letter to Dr. Wood. So even though they called their report the collapse of the World Trade Center towers, they sent a letter to Dr. Wood or Jerry Leapart or both to say, we didn't investigate the events after the collapse, only up to the point of collapse.
Right.
So how come they called their report the collapse of the World Trade Center towers? It should say before the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. The title of the report was fraudulent, and that could have been proved in a court of law had it been given the opportunity to do that. So SAIC, they were a defendant. What do SAIC do? They develop directed energy weapons components.
Right, and how many companies in the world design these type of weapons?
Probably not many. The other one of the other ones is a company called Applied Research Associates, which also helped to write the NIST technical reports, and they were also defendants of Dr. Judy Wood. They also do directed energy weapons research.
Right.
Applied Research Associates.
Right,
so, my point is, we then switched to somebody like Stephen Greer, who, of course, started me off on this road in 2003. If you read Stephen Greer's book, the disclosure book, the executive briefing from 2001, which company is mentioned in there about 5 or 6 times? Science Applications International Corporation.
Right.
They are big benefactors of the black budget.
Right.
So I will ask you, Pierre, how many other UFO type researchers have you heard talk about Science Applications International Corporation or SAIC, to your knowledge?
None, I don't think.
None.
It's very much off the radar.
Right. So that, to me, none. And we're talking about people who don't watch mainstream news, who
read these
go
type
to
of books.
read these type of books. They do conferences. How many of those people have said, "Yep, Science Applications International Corporation are benefactors of the black budget, and they were involved in the events of 9/11. They know something about it"? None. Now, to me, getting to my point in this quite lengthy sort of build-up is, to me, that is the state of disclosure.
And that is the
there is no disclosure. There is none.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there.
So Stephen Greer is now, I mean, he was actually asked this question directly by a chap who actually wrote to me and thankfully sent me a link to this video. And in fact, I'll try and get you the quote. I've got it on my phone, so we'll just have a very brief pause here. while I get this quote. But basically, Stephen Greer was basically asked the question about 9/11,
Yeah.
and I could even send Anthony the audio, because I think this is central to what the sorts of topics that we're covering in this interview.
Yeah.
He was asked the question about energy weapons and 9/11, and I'll see if I can find this. Let's just have a look. Is it going to be there?
So obviously someone else wasn't buying the official story.
Right. The chap that I spoke to, he'd read Dr. Judy Wood's book.
Yeah.
And let's just see. So that's what. So anyway, right. So Greer, going back to him, he basically got asked this question in November 2015 by this chap that I know called Alan.
Yeah.
And he says there's compelling evidence that not just the towers but the entire World Trade Center complex was destroyed by perhaps a directed energy type of weapon, something that was operating on a technology of molecular dissociation. That seems to be very much related to what you've been talking about in his lecture. Greer had done this 3-hour lecture.
Right.
So he talked about that sort of technology. And he says, I have looked at it, I have bigger fish to fry, he says.
Right, okay.
9/11 was terrible.
Yeah.
We lost 3,000 people. It led to 2 huge wars and trillions of dollars. And there's a long pause. I will tell you this. I'm not going to get into specifics.
Right.
Why not, Stephen?
Yeah.
Why not get into the specifics that the company that your witnesses mentioned, Science Applications International Corporation, are implicated in 9/11?
Yeah. You see, to me, that sounds like a scripted answer.
Yeah. I mentioned a gentleman named Richard Faust, third highest guy, Richard Faust at the Naval Research Labs. Naval Research Labs, there's a clue perhaps. He was in meetings with the then Vice President of the United States, Cheney, and he said absolutely it was known about in advance. There was involvement at that level, and he told me, and I have witnesses, multiple witnesses to this, that if he were to speak of this, now he's passed away, that he, his wife and his children and his grandchildren would all be killed. That's all I'm going to say on the 9/11 issue. But there is a lot to that story. I've never shared publicly what I just said. But the man has passed away. So it's not hard to, and I think most people get into these grand conspiracy theories. This is Greer talking. Basically, all you have to do is stand down, he says. There's constant threat. There is terrorism out there. This is Greer speaking. There is terrorism out there.
Yeah.
You don't even have to hoax an event.
Is it just human? I mean, this is another important question. But
you just have to stand down the systems that would have intercepted it. You understand what I'm saying? So it's like when you're doing a code blue. Boom, clear. You say clear before you do the electric shock. So you just clear the system and let it come in and hit. Now what I think happened on 9/11 is more like what I just described. And I have very good reason to believe that because someone of that integrity and rank had a front seat and knew about it, and I've never spoken of this before right now, but I think that it's disturbing, it's enraging, it's a minor rounding error compared to what's coming, he says, Greer. Right. If we don't end this cartel's hegemony, the secrecy related to UFOs, ETs and what have you, 9/11 is going to be a very minor blip on the screen. So that's my warning to people. You can take it or not. So it's giving a warning to people. Yeah. Is he warning people not to research into 9/11?
Yeah.
But I've known what you've just asked about since it happened. My whole security team lit up like you wouldn't believe. So this is Greer saying, now Greer is supposed to be a civilian. He's a former ER doctor, yet he has a security team. So that gives us a problem because either he has a security team or he doesn't. Yeah. If he does have a security team...
Who's he working for?
Why does he have one? If you have a security team, that means you're paying perhaps what? Let's be conservative. $40,000 a year to 2 people? You could call that a security team? Yeah. Where's he getting that sort of money from? Yeah. If he doesn't have a security team, then he's making it up. So why should he make stuff up? Yeah. So what Greer should be saying in answer to that question, yes, I know about 9/11, and thank you very much. Yeah. Read this book if you want to know more.
Exactly, yeah.
How long does that take? Yeah. Yet he spends, a couple of minutes there on all that sort of hand-waving, and I'm clever and I know people. Yeah. But instead, if you look at the former Canadian Defence Minister, Mr. Paul Hellyer, he holds that book up on camera in his talk. He holds it up to the camera.
Former Defence Minister.
500 pages of meticulous evidence. That's what Paul Hellyer does. Paul Hellyer was in government. Steve Greer's never been in government. Right. So which do you think is the honest person? Which is the dishonest person, do you think?
Well, it obviously seems that Greer has got an agenda to push,
Correct,
isn't it?
Correct. Correct. So that is my current state of understanding about Greer.
Do you think that with Greer, he's there just to keep the status quo, basically?
He is there to manage the limited hangout.
Right.
In other words, he is less now, for example, than he was in 2001. He's not bringing out any more information about the connection between free energy technology and the ET issue. Like, he hasn't said, for example, well, I've had this witness who's worked on the propulsion system. He says it operates on X principle and Y principle.
Right.
This is clearly related to this weapons technology which
Yeah.
was used to destroy the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
He's not said. In fact, I'm about the only person that said that because that's with the evidence that I see before me. Frankly,
Yeah. Do you think there is a specific ET connection? I'm talking.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. The way that I tell other people about my thoughts on that are is that if you look at 9/11, and you think about ourselves, whoever did 9/11, whoever planned it, whoever executed it, they don't think like I do. When they say, "Oh, we're ruining the planet," no, we're not ruining the planet. Thank you very much. I'm not part of that group that's ruining the planet.
Yeah.
I'm trying to live, responsibly and with the resources that I use. No, we've been put into this situation, and this is what I wanted to emphasise in this interview. The problems that we are in are primarily being created by another group. They're not
super elite.
Yeah, super. Call them what you like. Call them Rothschilds, call them Bilderbergers, call them Zionists. It doesn't really matter what name you give to them. They are a group which has money, power, but as well as that, they have technology and they have knowledge. They have clearly some links to secret societies, such as Freemasons, such as some of the ancient groups that I think you will have written about. And they have knowledge about which you've talked about in the separate spheres. And really, the disclosure that needs to happen is to connect those things together. Right. Because once you start to connect together the fact that, okay, Mr. Greer, yes, we've had ET landings. Yes, we've had back engineering of technology. What's it resulted in? It's resulted in the suppression of free energy. So what's Mr. Greer's response been to that? Well, he's organised these groups such as Seize Power and so forth. And he organised the Orion group and the Sirius Disclosure Technologies. All of these groups, he said...
And these are big players in terms of occult symbolism as well.
Well, you'd know more about that than me. But he said that these groups are going to work to get a free energy device onto the market. And he's been saying that for 15 years. And we've seen no free energy devices...
So you think he's a collecting house, basically?
Yes,
he's collecting
you've got it. He is attracting... In the same way that I was sucked into this scholars group, where they could see what I was doing, they could look at my psychology, they could look at what buttons they might be able to press with me, and what my knowledge was, what my knowledge wasn't. Greer has been doing that as well.
Hypothetically, for those scientists out there who are developing free technology, where should they go with this information? What should they do? Should they be completely independent and publish it on the net?
That's about all they can do, and many of them have done that. Because the reason being, like, for example, if we get into that issue a bit more, Greer said he wants to get all this money and invested and so forth. And this is what was said to Bruce De Palma in 1980, who invented the N machine. He invented this kind of like a self-powering dynamo, you might call it, without going to the technicalities. He was a physicist too. And Edgar Mitchell went to visit him and said, right, we want to develop this, Dr. Palmer, Dr. De Palma, can you, we want to set up this General Motors style company, $300 million, and then we're going to pay you $30,000 a year as a consultant. And he said, no, you're not. And then Edgar Mitchell said to him, if you're going to do things like this on your own in Southern California, you're going to get your head blown off. That's what Mitchell said to him, according to De Palma.
Did he take the job then, or did he just...
he went to live in New Zealand.
Okay.
And died there in 1997, De Palma. So in other words, of course De Palma wanted to get investment in this technology. Of course he wanted to get it developed. And this has been tried before. And of course, we all know who has all the money and power. They have all the intelligence. And then, you can take probably 100 other examples. Like, for example, the Lutec device. That's another one that I've talked about, and I'll just mention that briefly. Another free energy device. Again, a type of sort of fancy type of dynamo cum motor, a sort of dynamo and a motor together that outputs 3, 4 or 5 kilowatts.
Right.
They invented this in around about 2001 in Australia. Lou Britz
Yeah.
and John Christie, I think, were their names.
Right.
And you can check this out.
Mm.
What happened with their device? Well, I think what they did was, yes, indeed, they did invent a free energy device.
Right.
And then people say, oh, why weren't they running their house on it then if it was a free energy device?
Mm.
The problem was, like with many of these devices, it would only run for about an hour and then it would overheat or something would break and they need to put in a new bearing or a new washer or a gasket or whatever, whatever it was. And indeed,
so it needed further development.
Correct. Yeah. In other words, they got the basic principle, proof of concept working, but to make this into something which they could, distribute like a vacuum cleaner, they would need $10 million Australian dollars of investment minimum to get, all the machine tools, designs, debugging, servicing, and that sort of thing. And it would be the same with any type of mechanical device or really anything that needed a large-scale production.
Yeah.
And you, if you want to start that going, you're not going to get it.
Are these free energy machines, are they all working on different principles, or are they all essentially working on the same principle?
From my understanding, they work on different principles. This particular one, the Lutech device, was a mechanical device.
So gosh, doesn't that open up a can of worms? So it's not only that we're looking at just one potential technology, but there could be dozens or even hundreds.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are solid state. You've got things like the Bedini motor.
Yeah.
You've got Schauberger's device, which was allegedly over unity under certain conditions. You've got things like cold fusion, which is an electrolysis experiment. Yeah. But universally, if you look around, all of these have been shut down.
Right.
And so, in other words...
Which in your opinion, shows the most potential in terms of technology which could be sort of exploited?
Well, I think something like the N machine, as was originally designed, had a very high potential.
Okay.
And then perhaps second on my list might be something like cold fusion. Right. But other people would disagree. But the point about this is the point about this is people ask, well, why haven't we got this technology? Why hasn't Greer been successful? Why haven't these other people been successful? Two main reasons. People like Greer, as you said, or implied, and I would agree with you, he is a collection agency.
Yeah.
He is there to soak up the people and feedback that intelligence.
Yeah.
And then you've got the weaponization aspect, which was the other aspect which nobody talks about.
No.
In other words, the people in the shadows, whoever they are, they know about free energy technology. Yep. It has already been weaponized.
How old is this technology? I mean, are we going back to the Second World War, or could we be going back further?
My suggestion would be Roswell. That's probably where a lot of the research started.
I mean, could we be going back to Tesla?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's the most obvious one, actually, because that's what's talked about in the book.
Right. So the comparison between, let's say, the Tesla coil and
absolutely.
Natural forces.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hurricane.
But that would again fit into the crop circle, and that would also explain why there's been an attempt to debunk the crop circles.
I would agree with you entirely, Pierre, yes, because going back to that, in that book there is a reference to crop circles.
Right.
Near the back, and it's
to do remind me, I've read the book, but it was a few years ago.
If you look in there, you'll find that there's reference to magnetised iron spherical
in the actual crop circles.
Yes, in the soils underneath the crop, and these also were found. These iron microspheres were found in the dust at the World Trade Center.
Right,
and they were said to be the remnants of thermite reactions by Stephen E. Jones.
Right.
So I would argue that he was then saying that was the result of a chemical reaction, when actually it's a fingerprint of the energy technology.
It's taking the evidence and distorting the evidence.
Distorting it and saying it's not that, it's this. Yeah. I'm a clever, listen to me.
And what do you think in terms of the crop circles and the pictograms? Because I think what's interesting about the pictograms is that, although in my opinion, I know this is controversial, I actually think that all of them are probably fake, but what they're doing is they're inserting occult information in terms of platonic solids, esoteric information about even about ET, about extraterrestrials, and so again they're jumbling up fact and fiction.
I would agree with you.
And I think that one of the principal reasons why they're doing this is that they're trying to stay away from the natural phenomenon of what the crop circle is. And the reason for that is because it fits into what you're saying in terms of how ET is getting here, free energy, the exploitation of energy. So,
well, I've done a whole presentation on that subject, and actually I gave this a couple of weeks ago at Shepley, an updated version of it. And yes, broadly speaking, I agree entirely with what you just said. I think there probably could well be an ET angle to it, as a lot of people suspect. I think there's a big black ops element to it. If you watch Richard D. Hall's film, Crop Circle's Hidden Truth, you can clearly see that there is an MI5 intelligence connection to the phenomenon, which if it's just all to do with silly people walking with planks in a field, it doesn't make any sense. Why would the intelligence services be concerned with such silly pranks? It doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, you've got Colin Andrews and the Operation Blackbird in the 1990s. So there is clearly a real phenomenon that's important
Blackbird.
in there.
What was Operation Blackbird?
Well, that was where uniformed military officers were setting up equipment alongside Colin Andrews and Pat Delgado and a few other people.
Yeah.
And they were trying to film a crop circle forming in the field at night when it was done.
Intriguing.
And apparently they did do this, and then Colin Andrews tells this story to Hilly Rose on an audio that I've got, where they did in fact film it. Colin Andrews saw the videotape, then he went away from the machine and went to somebody else, came back and the tape had been taken out and a blank tape put in its place, or a tape with no event on it. He tells all of that in various audios. So there is clearly a connection. And the other effect that is important is the residual energy. When you go into a crop circle, and I was with David Caton, as I said the other day, and he has taken a Geiger counter into a field, crop circle, and he gets a Geiger counter reading of quite a high level after a crop circle has formed. So he got residual energy, which is exactly what happened at the World Trade Center, was dust degrading, materials rusting.
What about sulfur? Because I know in the very earliest... Yeah, in the earliest traditions of crop circles, dating from, I think, is it Professor Plott who did a
Robert Plott,
he talked about sulfur being in crop circles. I mean, he was also talking about multiple crop circles and very large crop circles as well. Yeah, I'm
not familiar with all the details of that. I know that he tasted some of the soil and he said it had a sort of an insipid taste or something.
Yeah,
maybe a sulfurous
he was
taste.
talking about sulfur. But I think sulfur's quite interesting because it's associated with demonic materialisation.
Well, I mean, talking back about 9/11, again, you look at some of the symbolism surrounding that, and that gets you into more esoteric realms. I'm not sure about the sulfur angle so much. I've not really heard of that. But, like the 110 stories of the World Trade Center, or 111 if you count the top floor, in both towers, what did the towers look like? Number 11.
Yeah.
When did it happen? On the 11th, on the 11th of September, 9/11. Yeah. What was opposite the World Trade Center? The Millennium Hotel. When did 9/11 happen? In the first year of the new millennium. Yeah. 2001. Because 2000 was the old millennium, 2001 is the new millennium. What was the Millennium Hotel modelled on? It was modelled on the monolith in the Stanley Kubrick film, which, if you look at the symbolism in the 2001 Stanley Kubrick film, what does the monolith represent? It seems to represent some transformation of consciousness for the human mind. That's in summary. That's what it's symbolic of. So clearly there is something to me.
Well, I'm also thinking about the pancake theory, because Pan was the goat god, and the cake would be an offering to Satan, or to the on God.
Yeah, you could make these arguments from etymology too. So what I'm saying is, to me, disclosure is the act of talking about what I'm telling you now. Yeah. To me, this is disclosure.
I totally agree, and I came to that conclusion myself a few years ago.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to get it from our government, because this secret has been classified.
Right. So you're not going to get it from the government, and there's been a bit of hoo-ha recently. Here we are speaking in early December 2016, and we've just passed the US presidential election, and there was some hoo-ha, wasn't there, about Hillary Clinton.
Right. Remind me of the story.
Yeah, because she did this slot on the Jimmy Kimmel show, didn't she? And said that if she was elected, she was going to look into the UFO files, or as she called it, the UAP files, the unexplained aerial phenomenon, and she explicitly used this term, which was interesting. Right. I know some people have pointed that out. Yeah. But look at Clinton. Go and look at her background. Benghazi, tainted blood. Yeah. Anyone heard about tainted blood? Yeah. These people are psychopaths. Clinton actually has left a trail of dead bodies behind him in his sort of line to power, and afterwards.
And again with the drugs and all these different stories.
Yeah. Watch a film called The Clinton Chronicles, which has been posted on YouTube by Anonymous, and about that was released in 1994. The Clinton Chronicles film, and people testifying on camera to what the Clintons were up to then. how are you going to get disclosure from people like this? Why are people even writing about this?
Are they, in terms of, let's say, Tony Blair, etc., I mean, are these people going to be taken to task in the court of law, or do you think they're just untouchable?
I don't think so. I think at the moment, as things stand at the moment, they're untouchable.
But having said that, we have moved forward, because I know...
A little.
Well, 40 years ago, I don't recall any Prime Minister being taken to task or being accused of any type of crime. So in the sense, the idea that Tony Blair broke the law, at least it's there within the public consciousness, even if he's being protected.
I think there is an argument for some things like that. And of course, we're having this conversation now in the way that we are, which again wouldn't have been possible even 20 years ago, really.
I think there was more conformity in terms of politics 30 years ago.
Yes, I think there's less trust, but then again, I think maybe that's because the hidden power structure has become a lot stronger, and so they don't really care how the public view the sort of public power structure, because the hidden power structure can deal with any problems in the public power structure,
as
with its hidden power.
With the exit of Britain and all those problems in terms of the referendum, etc.
Yeah. And we've seen that as a polarised people, and then now they've said they have these high court decisions. So you're getting polarisation all around, really, and people are left thinking, what the hell is going on? Yeah. What can we latch onto in life? You know, we can't rely on priests because they're all paedophiles. We can't rely on teachers because they all know nothing. You know, we can't rely on doctors because they just kill people too much because of the various health errors.
So you think there's a great deal of despondency at the moment? This is the current situation.
There is a great deal of despondency, and sometimes people don't know where to turn to. I wouldn't say it's universal, but there is an awful lot of angst and concern.
And what about the young population? Are they doing anything? Because I know in the 60s there was always this general perception that there was this rebellion with the youth.
I think
this same type of...
Not. I think it's different now. It's a lot different. I think there are a few people that are aware of some of the topics we're talking about, and I know a few young people that have cottoned onto it. Right. But over and above that, there is a great deal more to distract young people now than there was. Yeah. And it's more, like, for example, we have 24-hour TV now. Yeah. When you and I were younger, you know, going back to our teens and early before teens, we didn't have 24-hour TV. We only had it on a few hours a day. Yeah. Same with internet. We didn't have internet, so we didn't have this. Yeah, we didn't have this.
Just being connected to the World Wide Web, essentially.
Right. So you got that as a sort of connection to that.
Do you think there's a lot of propaganda which is being aimed at this new generation, trying to shape and mould this generation?
I would say, in a word, it's noise. Right. There is a far greater now noise. There's a lot more noise on the internet. There's a lot more noise on TV. Yeah. And a lot of TV and a lot of internet stuff is very superficial. Right. It doesn't really have the detail that we used to have in some of the... Like, take a science documentary, I used to watch the Horizon programmes. They even did one in 1982 on the remote viewing programme. Right. And they interviewed, people like Ingo... I think they might have interviewed Ingo Swan. They definitely interviewed Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, for example. You wouldn't get that now, not on a 9 o'clock BBC Two mainstream programme.
But is that just because it's so accessible on the net anyway? So what's the
point?
No,
I don't think so. I think they now have to suppress that in the mainstream, or at least put in the ridicule factor.
So you think they're actually more conservative now, the media outlets?
Yes, in certain ways, yes.
Right. How has the UFO paradigm, how has that shifted, or hasn't it shifted in terms of the media?
I think now, like, for example, as Richard Hall has pointed out several times, when you get a programme about UFOs, it is often done by a comedian or somebody like that. Yeah, you wouldn't get a serious sort of academic scientist having a sort of literature review or video type review.
We ought to have a sort of an entertainment programme about black holes, because that's just all pie in the sky, isn't it? No one's photographed a black hole, have they?
Well, that's it.
They teach it on the curriculum as well as the real deal is done.
And I remember reading this story a few years ago about some amateur astronomer. He'd photographed some type of nova outburst, which was very brief. I think it only lasted for a few hours. Yeah. And he described this and sent the letter into an astronomy website or magazine. And he said he'd watched this nova outburst, and he was the only person in the world to have seen it. And the astronomy magazine didn't question his story at all.
Right.
Even though he said he was the only person in the world to have seen it.
Right.
He didn't say, "Oh, you're seeing things, mate. Are
Yeah.
you sure you really saw it?" No, you didn't see that. What you saw was a shooting star.
Right.
But because he was talking about an astronomical phenomenon, they didn't question him.
Right.
And that attitude is still the same. It really is still the same.
I mean, the idea in terms of, let's say, the government, let's say with the X-Files, for example, I mean, that put across the idea that there was this underlying sort of governmental conspiracy. Do you think that really did change public consciousness? Did it direct it more towards a conspiratorial way of looking at...
I think things like the X-Files and anything similar to that, it awakens people to the possibilities that we've been discussing, but they remain in a state of doubt. And it doesn't matter. Yeah. If they're in a state of doubt about it, doesn't matter. Yeah. So really, it's just entertainment. So the X-Files doesn't say, this is true, everyone. You need to change the way that you're living. You need to tell other people what you know. Yeah. It's not that. It's a form of entertainment. Right. It's a form of limited hangout, to use that expression again. Yeah. It makes you interested, but it doesn't make you certain.
I mean, is there also an intention there to draw, let's say, a comparison between the subjects of UFOs and the fact that it's entertainment? So
yes, correct. Yeah. So, and anything that's in there, it's again, you cover up reality by presenting it as fantasy.
Because I've noticed that in terms of, let's say, studying classics, there's been a big agenda within the academia to actually suppress UFOs within religion and anthropology, the sensible discussion. Yeah, yeah. What they typically do, I mean, for example, if you take the idea of a shield, there's a very famous story of shields which were said to have destroyed some cities which Alexander had attacked. Now, anyone who's studied, let's say, classics, know that shields were used. Not only were they used as symbols of flying saucers or angelic vessels, what we talked about earlier in the interview, but they were also used as projectiles or military weapons, in which they would fill them up with sand and excrement, and then they would fire them as a projectile at the enemy. So instantly, in terms of the classical professors, the anthropologists, people who've studied religions and the classical sources, they would look at this information and say, oh, well, yeah, that's obviously a projectile. So at one level, yes, it draws in Joe Bloggs, but actually it's not aimed at Joe Bloggs, because they're not bothered about what Joe Bloggs thinks. What they're interested in is what the professors or the academics think. And there is an agenda to subvert the information within the university system.
Well, I mean, that's it. I mean, if you shape their thinking, you're able to influence their thinking enough, then you automatically capture most of the population. Yeah. It's like this bogus climate change nonsense. What they've needed to do is create a consensus, which they've been doing since the late 1980s, and they've been successful. Yeah,
you can from the school curriculum now.
Yeah, exactly.
Well. And global warming.
And I drove past another truck on the motorway today, so this truck has so many tons of CO2 less per year or something. Yeah. So that's irrelevant. You know, all of that is bogus.
Well, the CO levels have changed anyway during different periods.
Correct. But nothing to do with the amount of fuel that we're burning.
With the sun.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything's to do with the sun.
So as we were saying earlier on, most of the things which are taken to be fact in the mainstream are not fact at all. Yeah. They're a consensus reality that we've been persuaded to agree with. Yeah. And we are discouraged from disagreeing with it. Right. Okay. So there's two things. One, we're persuaded that we agree with it. And we're, on the other hand, discouraged from disagreeing with it. Right. Okay. So we get this conformism.
Yeah. So there's this consensus.
That has also been happening within the so-called truth movement or the alternative knowledge movement. Right. There is a consensus being created. Yeah. Going back 10 years.
It's almost like in the alternative media, there is the mainstream.
There is a consensus created.
Where if you go outside of that, then you're instantly ridiculed.
Yeah, there is a consensus created.
You're a fringe within a fringe.
Then. Yeah. I certainly am. Yeah. There's a consensus created that, for example, the World Trade Center wasn't destroyed by an energy weapon, or we don't know if it was or it wasn't.
Right, again, the ambiguity. Play the ambiguity card.
Yes, you play the ambiguity card. Yeah. Whereas I know that is what actually happened.
And I think one of the credible ideas which proves that something strange or anomalous happened is that we would have expected there to be hundreds of feet of rubble, and yet where was it? It's just a bigger hole.
That's right. You can see
it's
blindingly obvious once you see it. And people, I had some person write to me quite recently who'd just seen it for the first time, and they were sort of thinking, how have I never seen this? How have I not seen this in 15 years?
The obvious?
And it is relatively recent.
But
so
then again, it's not
this.
obvious because it's never something like that has never really been seen before.
Well, it's not been made obvious because of the images that have been shown to people.
The doctoring of the images.
Yes, or just not showing certain images like upside down cars. You don't see those upside down car images on certain websites even.
Yeah. So again, it's the redaction of history, the editing.
The redaction of history. It's edited, and this is true in the disclosure movement. And as I've said, until we have disclosure and open disclosure, like what I would love to see, looking at the future sort of side of things, is I would love to see Stephen Greer say, read that book. I'd love to see Steve Bassett saying, well, actually, we're not really going to get any disclosure from the presidents because they're actually part of the control mechanism.
Have you got any opinions on Bassett?
Well, I mean, he's another one. He's been going around saying... for years, Obama's going to be the disclosure president. Yeah. Well, how long has he got left? Is it now? It's about 2 months for Obama to be the disclosure president. And Bassett's been saying that for nearly 8 years. Yeah. When is he going to learn? There's another clip I've got of Bassett's talking about the war in Iraq, right? Which was from the secret space program from 2014. I've got an article about it on my website. Yeah. And he's saying, perhaps this technology from the flying saucers has been developed into a weapon. Some secret weapon, that would be really awful, wouldn't it? Yeah. And he was saying that in 2014. Steve,
there it is.
This is a weapon that's been developed in secret as part of maybe something to do with black programs, at least, if not the ET program. Would you like to talk about that, Steve? Never mentioned it. Won't speak to me. When I was at the Exopolitics conference last year in 2015 that Anthony organised, he just didn't even bother speaking to me. Right. He didn't say to me, "Oh, you know that book, Andrew? Have you got any copies of it? Can I have one?" Yeah. If he'd asked me for one, I said, Stevie, mate, you have it. You read it. Try and mention it in your talk, because I think, you know what? That's relevant to what you're talking about. Not in the centre of what you talk about, but it's a big thing that you need to talk about. Yeah, it's a big part of it, mate. But,
no, I know. Having spoken to Bassett myself, I was speaking to him and I said, well, what's your opinions about that the aliens are here and interfacing with human beings in terms of interfacing within the governments? And he totally just denied that and discredited that and said that was not a possibility. Yeah. And I actually think that in itself is very interesting, because if they're in the sky, and we know from the anthropological record that if this is not a psychological phenomenon, and I don't believe it is, then they've been here for a long time. So why wouldn't they be? Why wouldn't they be interested in the power structure? So at least the fact for him that question itself wasn't even on the table, I think in itself is problematic. Yeah,
and that's also part of the disclosure issue in terms of you've got to look into the history, the stuff that you talk about, the ancient alien question, that all factors into it. And more honestly, when people ask me that sort of thing, I say, well, I'm not an expert on this, but I've looked into it, and I think this factors into it as well.
But there are so many different strands to the tapestry, so many different threads.
And that, I think, is also a barrier, because you mentioned earlier on when we were talking before we started the interview about, so you're interested in a lot of different things, aren't you, Andrew? And I said, well, I suppose yes, I am. Primarily sciences and technology and that sort of thing. But I have read other books. I was brought up a Catholic, so you think about religion and what religion means.
And I was brought up a Christian as well.
It's
a good entry point into this subject.
Right. So all these things factor in, and I'd like to see, certainly, talking about 9/11 and UFOs, there is really only two other researchers that have come to my mind, possibly three, that have covered those areas and covered them not very well. Right. First one is Jim Marrs, who again won't talk about what's in that book. He's sort of made muted noises about it, but that's about all.
Why do you think that? Do you think that for some people it's just so above their head? I mean, the book itself is so cutting edge. Do you think for some people it is just above?
Partly, they feel that they don't want to. I think a lot of Americans don't like talking about 9/11. And it's mostly the researchers that.
Do you think that they don't want to rock the boat as well, because they know it's such a controversial subject?
I think it's sometimes partly that they know that other people don't like talking about 9/11, so they don't. Right. But other times I think it goes beyond that. Certainly, Steve Bassett, for example, he doesn't talk about it. He would be a logical person to talk about it. Richard Dolan, I had a meeting with him in the summer. I don't know whether he's going to sort of talk about it more, but Richard Dolan did write an article about 9/11 years ago.
He's writing a book on PSYOPs, isn't he?
He's writing a book about false flag operations. So
is Dr. Judy Wood's work going to be at least mentioned in the footnote?
I certainly spoke about that with Richard in the summer when I met him.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the end result was going to be at this point, to be brutally honest.
Yeah.
And then the other person that's talked a bit about it.
For me as well, I mean, I'm convinced with the information in that book that there is true. But even, for example, if you were a researcher and you didn't buy what Dr. Judy Wood was saying, you would still think that it's an important part of research.
Yeah, exactly.
It's part of the discourse which needs to be talked about and discussed.
Yes, indeed. And that's a bottom line, and that's what hasn't really happened that much, or not as much as it needed to have happened.
Yeah.
And again, to implicate companies like Science Applications International Corporation, get them under oath in a court, is that going to happen? Well, probably not. But in an ideal world, maybe that would allow us to find out more about some of the technology side, where it went, where it's come from, who owns it, etc., etc. Is there an alien group involved? Yeah. Would that lead us to evidence of that? I'd sure like to find out. I don't know at this point, but I'd love to find out.
So do you think that aliens are interfacing with human beings?
Yes, I do. And I think there's a number of lines of evidence for that. One is, for example, the research of Lloyd Pye, which we haven't really talked about to this point, with the genetics. Other lines, the abduction experiences, which seem to be connecting to some alien type of consciousness somehow. And then, of course, thanks, Anthony, we have we'll just mention this briefly. I won't talk a lot about this because, again, I've done other videos about this. I'll be talking about this in Swansea. I've basically ripped off all of Lloyd's slides that I'd had copies of from him, and I've sort of re-edited those into a new presentation. Which I'll be doing in Swansea in January. Yeah. And this is the replica skull, the physiology of this. Clearly, when you've studied it and you look at the DNA tests that have been done, this cannot be human. It's not even close. So that
it's not even mammalian.
No, it's not even mammalian. And all the evidence from this again, and few people will talk about this. I've never heard Stephen Greer talking about it. No. What does he talk about? He talks about this humanoid Atacama alien that was discovered in the Atacama Desert or somewhere near this, which is actually a human. It's a deformed human, according to Dr. Gary Nolan. But Greer won't talk about this either. So this is more limited hangout. This is really important. Yet the person that talked about it the most is now no longer with us, sadly. So hard physical evidence, DNA tested, etc. This is the real deal. Yet where's disclosure movement about with it? Hardly anywhere. It does get occasional mention, but where does Stanton Friedman talk about this? Does Richard Dolan? Does Stephen Greer? Does Jim Mars? Does Steve Bassett? Has Steve Bassett come up to Lloyd Pye or Melanie Young and said, "Hey, can I take that skull to the members of Congress that I'm going to see and show them?" Has he said that?
No,
not to my knowledge. So this is the problem. This is the problem. Why the disclosure that you're going to get is done by you. It's done by you. It's your own disclosure to yourself, and realizing that all this is connected.
Yeah, and I think that this is important. I mean, it's about just changing you have to change the influence or sphere of influence within your region and within your expertise.
Right.
And I actually think that this is another thing as well. I kind of compare disclosure to a circuit board, that each little chip is important and it has its own expertise. So a teacher can go into the classroom and begin to discuss some of these ideas to the children. A person who knows the law can begin to question or draft out new laws, and this is what needs to be happening. So it's not so much that we have to get groups of collectivized consciousness which can be swung very easily by these sinister forces, but it's a matter of actually just getting a lot of people doing actually very, very little. All it would take maybe is for each individual to do maybe an hour's work, and we could actually get quite a lot done.
I tend to agree with you in the right way. I tend to agree with you. Yeah, it is personal responsibility, but again, our culture doesn't encourage that so much. We're now, more reliant on doctors to give us good health.
On
like
the experts.
The experts. Yeah. We don't grow our own food very much. I certainly don't. I'm not. I don't. We don't live off the land anymore. We've
Yeah.
lost that connection to the earth, the physical earth.
Mm.
All of those are issues too.
Yeah.
And so it's again a holistic picture that we need to think of.
Mm.
But I know, and having seen this, I know, for example, we don't need roads. We don't need cars. This is all a scam.
Yeah.
I know. I'm convinced, and I feel that I know that geoengineering is going on. The weather is being controlled.
Yeah.
So all this talk of climate change,
Yeah.
again, it's just another scam.
Yeah.
We can cure cancer.
Yeah.
You know, cancer can be cured with readily available materials like cannabis oil,
Yeah.
readily treatment like cannabis oil,
Yeah.
and even things like baking soda,
Again, and flaxseed oil as well.
flaxseed oil.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
some of these things are incredibly easy to deal with.
Yeah.
Yet people, the consensus is that they aren't. You know, so we have.
Well, again, I just think, even let's say if you wanted to go down the route of saying, okay, we've got to traditionally get rid of the cancer by poisoning in this, right? And I know that that's the traditional way.
Yeah.
But why chemotherapy? There's so many other different poisons.
Yeah. Yeah.
It kind of feeds into the nuclear industry. It's
Yes,
all
yes.
interconnected.
Yes.
You know, what about cyanide? What about... there's all kinds of different poisons.
So that's it. So
or even osmosis. Somehow using osmosis to extract the moisture from the cancer
cells. Yeah. So I mean, these are all issues and areas that I'd like people to consider. You know, I certainly tried to. I think where I've tried to do things a bit differently, and it's for my own development as well, is I've taken some of these topics like the health topic, crop circles, 9/11, solar system stuff.
Well, you see, you're very diverse, and I think that you've got your fingers in a lot of different parts.
That's what I felt I've needed to do to get an understanding,
to get a bigger
to get a bigger picture and understand what the hell's actually wrong with the world and why it's like it is. And I think I don't mean to sound big-headed. I've got a pretty good understanding of that now.
You've got a good angle on this.
I hope so, and I hope that more people will kind of try and do that too, but not be taken in by the bullshitters, basically.
Yeah.
For want of a better word.
And it's like what you're saying. It's about doing your own research,
taking responsibility for your own knowledge.
The problem is a lot of this knowledge is becoming centralised, and with that centralisation, if we're not careful, I don't want to be too cynical, but if we're not careful, it can be easily hijacked and subverted.
Yes. Yeah, it has been, and it is being all the time.
And I totally agree with that.
You know, so that is why it's important. You know, I've tried to certainly to give away all the information. Like my website, for example, is not subscription based or anything like that. And I give these DVDs away when I've done them and sell them.
You've given me loads of DVDs. In fact. They've actually been very useful for me just to get an angle on what's going on.
So that's my philosophy. And obviously not everyone can do that because not everyone has the time and the resources to do that.
Yeah.
But my own situation with the OU work, where I've mainly been based at home, that's allowed me to do that. It's given me that space. And those resources.
I do have a question about Dr. Judy Wood's research. Is she planning on releasing a new book? Where is she at the moment with her research?
Well, she had started to write another book. I think it's sort of gone on a back burner because there were some technical problems with her computer a while ago, which I think has sort of meant that some of that has been put on a back burner, basically.
Right. What was the nature of the book? Was it?
Well, she wanted to write a book more about the plane crash type of scenario at the World Trade Center. I know she was looking into that.
Computer graphics side.
Well, not so much CGI, but looking at the evidence that the plane crashes weren't real and what she could prove from that. There's certain things that can be proved, certain things which are less.
I mean, there was this idea inserted into the Truth movement, and I don't know if this is true or not. Maybe you can shed light on this in terms of missiles hitting the buildings. And again, could that be possible in terms of, like, we want people to believe that they're planes, but if they're not going to believe that they're planes, then we want them to believe that something hit the building. You know, it's almost this way. It's almost preempting what people are going to think, and then preempting what the cynical people are going to say and think, and directing that thought pattern.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as Dr. Wood says, the planes were used to encourage people to make assumptions. That's a really good way of putting it.
Okay.
So you look at the plane, you know, the issues at the World Trade Center, plane events. You're encouraged to make assumptions about them, as in a real plane crash, real terrorists.
Yeah. And essentially, a plane is just you can say that's just another metaphor for a missile. So the plane is a missile.
Could be, yeah. So
but when we're talking about missiles or projectiles, we're not actually talking about focused weapons.
Not exactly, and I mean, that's another area I haven't really got into, but for example, there is evidence in Dr. Wood's book that shows you that there was an energy change at the exact same time as the first hole appeared in the World Trade Center. There was a dip in the Earth's magnetic field coincident with that. So,
so we are dealing here with significant amounts of energy.
Yes. So that's what it looks like was involved in creating holes. So are we actually
dealing with potentially this technology is so significant that you could maybe even destroy a planet with it or something?
Who knows? Well, George Lucas's films, is that... Yeah. Does he know stuff,
With the asteroid belt as well, I mean...
Well, was that... Yeah, I mean, some people say that. I don't know, that's all speculative, but the logical sort of extreme is that if you can engineer the underlying fabric of reality, what can't you do? Yeah. Does this technology then... If you can if you can engineer the underlying fabric of reality, can you do mind control? Can you create clones of people by just somehow shifting reality so that a complete clone of that person is created?
Yeah, this is with the waveform as well. So rather than genetically engineering the organism, I mean, why would they want to do that? What they would want to do is manipulate the waveform, which would
maybe.
But again, that's as interesting philosophical questions, because if you can copy the waveform of another organism, then you're not just copying the organism, but you're actually copying their soul and their if you like, the temporal the manifestation of that organism throughout all the different time periods. I mean, of course, if the soul exists, but I think near-death experience tells us that...
Oh, I have no doubt that we do have, a soul and a body. And as you say, near-death experience, if anybody's not looked into that, look into it, because there is some clinical evidence now that people can describe things that have happened in the room around them while they're clinically dead. And that's been shown in a number of medical reports now, beyond any real sensible sort of questioning. So yes, it proves that we have an element of our consciousness which is disconnected. Can either
non-local even.
It's non-local. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. So that factors into this as well.
Do you think this factors into the alien manifestation as well?
To some extent. I mean, again, another good book to read that I have actually read is Rick Strassman's book, The Spirit Molecule, where he was looking at the effects of DMT on patients that he was doing the research with in the 1990s. Right. And they were sat on a hospital bed, they gave them DMT, they had a kind of an out-of-body experience, and what did they describe? They described an experience which was very similar to an alien abduction when he looked at the alien abduction accounts. And they described interacting with a non-human intelligence. Right. So...
But again, this would actually make sense, because if we just want to go with a conventional hypothesis about ET, if they can travel these vast distances in space, then that means that they can deconstruct time and space. They can deconstruct the mechanism of reality. And therefore, if the soul exists, then by inference they must have also deconstructed the spiritual element of reality as well. So we're seeing, not only are they, if you like, impinging upon the physical world and appearing as physical beings and interfacing with human beings, but we're also seeing that they're also impacting upon the spirit realm as well. And I think that in itself is carried out with near-death studies, that idea.
Yeah. And again, I mean, going back to Stephen Greer, he's spoken about things like that. But I think, again, he's done limited hangout. He hasn't... Yeah. I don't think he's connected all the available information.
Further as where it needs to go.
I don't think so. He hasn't connected all the information, and he's basically said there aren't any evil aliens and there are only good aliens. And how does he know that? Right. We don't truly know that.
Are there, in your mind, would you say, are there really any... I mean, obviously with the exception of Dr. Judy Wood, would you say that there are any really exceptional researchers where you're feeling that they're asking the right type of questions? Do you see that at the moment?
There are a few. I mean, like, for example, Paul Hellyer has been good enough to mention that book in his public talks, which I think is important. Michael Tellinger...
I mean, you would think that would be quite dangerous for him to do something
You would, but he's done it.
Right.
He's quite old now, he's in his 90s, but he's certainly been very brave with that. Michael Tellinger is also one of the few people that's mentioned it, and Michael Tellinger has talked a lot about energy in his experiments. But again, he's a little bit, I think he's a little bit prone to putting out too much speculative material in parts. But certainly what Michael Tellinger has done with some of the stuff on Adam's calendar, that's also very interesting. And he's talked about energy as well.
Did Tellinger write the book Slave Species?
That's right, Slave Species of God, yeah.
Right,
that's his book.
There were some interesting ideas in there, but I really did feel it was too dependent on Zecharia Sitchin's ideas.
Right, yeah. I mean, some of that has obviously been set up as a...
Yeah, and I find that material problematic, or some of that material.
Some of it, yeah. I've heard other people saying it.
Yeah.
You're not saying it's wrong or anything, but
no,
yeah.
I'm not saying it's all problematic. I think, again, you've got the mixing of truth and fiction together to create a very complex puzzle, very difficult picture too.
So I think there are certain people I would say are moving in a better direction than some of the others. Yeah. And as I say, Michael Tellinger's been willing to hold that up in one of his talks, saying, "Well, I'm talking about energy, but this is also about energy. Read the Word of the Towers Go book."
You need to read.
Yeah. So anybody that does that, to me, passes the litmus test. Anybody that's willing to actually mention that, because it is. Certainly from a technical, physical, evidential point of view, it's one of the most powerful books that's out there. Yeah. When you're talking about more of the esoteric stuff, the spiritual stuff, the consciousness stuff, how many papers have done, scientific papers have been written about experiments with consciousness? Not that many. There are some, but there's not many. So you're then into as Graham Hancock has said, you're then into an area where you're dealing with things that can't be counted, weighed, or measured. Yeah. So
I think you've also got
approach.
A problem with the language itself, because there's heavy connotations in terms of the paranormal and in terms of how that is actually viewed as well. So you're automatically, if you like, up against prejudice in terms of that certain words have certain limitations. I think a lot of this now, certainly think in terms of how I'm looking at symbolism, I've found myself that I've had to rewrite a lot of the language and terms because just they don't exist, or that they have the wrong emphasis, the wrong flavour. So again, I think that this is important in terms of actually that academics need to be writing the discourse and be very specific with the language and the terminology. So again, sometimes it is a question of semantics. Definitely,
it's a big factor in. It factors into this in a large way. The use of language, of course, because that's how we communicate. So once you control the language, you can control to a large extent the communication itself.
So what do you think about the idea that one's life can guide you in certain directions? How do you think that this has worked out for you? So if you just want to summarise that.
Yeah, well, this goes back to a bit of what I was saying before, in that I have had certain things come into my life, which have led me in a certain direction, particularly, as I said earlier on, with technology.
Through synchronicity?
Well, through my own interest that's developed. Yeah. And I've said this before to other people, that, for example, getting interested in home computing and finding out about all of that stuff, that now allows me to use technology in a way which is very advantageous to me. Yeah. I don't have to rely on anybody else to produce leaflets or DVDs or websites.
You're very savvy in terms of being self-sufficient.
Very much like Richard D. Hall in that regard, whose background is in technology. Yeah. So that's been highly advantageous. And then, for example, getting into work from my friend offering me that work at home. Yeah. That means that I don't have a boss breathing down my neck. Yeah. If I want to stop off for a couple of hours from work and do a bit on the website or respond to some emails,
you can do that.
I can do that without being interfered with. Yeah. So that has given me a lot of freedom. So I didn't seek for it to be like that particularly, but that I seem to have been guided into those areas, and also education. Yeah. I had a sort of interest in going into education, and I've done that as well. But that's also helped me in terms of picking up certain tips and skills, which help me with communication. I think one is guided, and you can follow certain cues that you're given, certain situations that you find yourself in. If you react to them in a positive way, I think the end result is. In other words, this old saying, everything happens for a reason. If you think of that, then and think, well, what can I learn out of this situation?
Yeah.
You end up, I think, it's more likely that you will follow if there is a higher path in your life,
Yeah.
you will find what that is.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say that, it's like a God thing or a religious thing. There is a larger plan.
Yeah.
We are fitting into a larger plan. I've no doubt about that.
I could totally concur with that.
So you can find. I think ultimately you can find out what that is if you're open to the idea and you follow certain cues and you're receptive to it. Exactly.
Okay, I'd just like to thank you, Andrew Johnson, for speaking to us and for taking your time on behalf of Anthony Beckett and on behalf of myself. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure talking.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you as well, Pierre and
great
Anthony.
To catch up again as
yeah,
well.
absolutely,
It's
been really good. So thank you to you both for all your efforts in setting all this up and the cameras and everything.
Right,
Brilliant.
thank you.
Thanks.